Story 1. My sister tried to ruin my relationship. After years of manipulation, forcing me to share a room with my ex at her wedding and sending fake photos of infidelity to my boyfriend when I was 20, my life took an unexpected turn, and not in the way I would have wanted. I was in my second year of university and dating someone who was then considered a good catch. He was 28, a close friend of my brother, and his presence in my house was so common that my parents treated him almost like another son. I admit that at first, I wasn't interested in dating him. He was one of those charming guys who always had a witty response or a compliment ready, but little by little his attention and charisma managed to break down my defenses, and I ended up agreeing to a relationship. What initially seemed like a romantic dream story transformed into a relationship that, over time, showed me a side of him I didn't want to accept. At first, everything was perfect. He took me to dinner at incredible places, he was thoughtful, and my family adored him. But after a year, significant differences began to emerge. I had clear goals. I wanted to finish my studies, specialize, and build a career in the corporate world. He, on the other hand, dreamed of a more traditional life, with a young family, and believed he could convince me that his vision was better. The first conflicts arose when he tried to get me to sacrifice small steps towards my career for activities or commitments that he considered important. "You can't go to that conference. I have tickets for a game and I know you'll love it," he would say. Although I tried to explain to him that these opportunities were essential for my growth, he always ended up making me feel guilty for prioritizing my goals over our relationship. After 3 years together, the inevitable happened. He proposed. It was my university graduation day. He had organized an elegant dinner with all my friends and family present. When he took out the ring, I saw the surprised look on my parents' faces and the gleam of excitement in my older sister's eyes. But all I felt was panic. I knew I wasn't ready. I told him no. I tried to explain to him that my refusal wasn't a rejection of him, but that I wasn't prepared for that step. I needed time to focus on myself, on my future. But he didn't understand. His reaction was immediate and curt. "So all this time you were just using me." That phrase resonated in my head for days. No matter how much I tried to explain my reasons, he was convinced that I had betrayed him. I decided to end the relationship. It was one of the most difficult decisions of my life because even though I didn't want to continue with him, I didn't want to hurt him. After the breakup, things became really awkward. He started coming to my house less, but he didn't disappear completely. My parents, in an attempt to keep the peace, tried to include him in family gatherings, and my brother was still his best friend. However, the biggest problem wasn't my ex, but my older sister. She was engaged to my ex's brother, which, according to her, was the perfect family dream. In her mind, my ex and I had to be together to complete this ideal puzzle she had created. When she found out about our breakup, she took it as a personal affront. "How could you do this? Don't you understand how perfect it would be for everyone if you got married? We would be a united family, always together at Christmas, holidays. It would be ideal." As much as I tried to explain to her that things weren't that simple, she insisted. She told me about my ex's qualities, how lucky I had been to find someone so dedicated. She even went so far as to tell me that I was selfish for not wanting to give him another chance. Not everyone is lucky enough to find someone who truly loves them. Think about what you're losing. At first, I tried to be patient with her. I understood that she was excited about her wedding and her idealized vision of our future lives. But the more she insisted, the more I realized that she was not only ignoring my feelings, but prioritizing hers above all else. The worst part was when she started to accidentally plan encounters between my ex and me at family gatherings, dinners, or events. He always ended up sitting next to me. Once, during a dinner at my parents' house, I realized that my place at the table had been changed at the last minute to be next to him. When I confronted my sister about this, she simply smiled and said, "I'm just trying to help you see what you're losing." Things came to a head when one day my sister organized an outing with friends to a nearby lake, and forgot to mention that my ex was also going. I was trapped in the middle of the lake in a boat with him, and although I tried to maintain my composure, he took the opportunity to try to convince me to come back. It was exhausting. I felt like everyone around me was conspiring to make me make decisions that weren't mine. After that awkward incident at the lake, I distanced myself as much as I could from my sister and any family plan that involved my ex. I focused on finishing my studies and building my career. However, keeping my distance wasn't as easy as I'd hoped. as my sister kept finding ways to involve me in her family plans. A few months later, she announced that she had finally set a date for her wedding. My parents were euphoric, my brother supported the idea, and well, I tried to keep a smile while knowing that my ex would be present at every step of the process. My sister never missed an opportunity to mention how much she wanted everything to be perfect and how important it was to her that I be fully involved. "You're not just my sister, you're my best friend. I want you to be my maid of honor," she said excitedly. I didn't want to be rude, but accepting that role meant being at the epicenter of all the meetings, rehearsals, and activities that would inevitably include my ex. I hesitated, but in the end, I agreed, thinking that maybe I could handle it. I couldn't imagine the magnitude of the manipulations that were to come. It all started innocently, with meetings to choose dresses and plan details. During those days, my sister insisted on bringing up my past relationship. "Remember how he always did this for you? He was so sweet to you. Don't you think anyone else will treat you like that?" I would just nod, hoping she'd change the subject, but the message was clear. She still dreamed of getting us back together. The real bomb dropped a month before the wedding when I found out that she planned to accommodate all the guests in a secluded place, a house on the outskirts, near a lake. "It's perfect," she said enthusiastically. "We'll all be together for the weekend, like one big family." The day before leaving for the house, I noticed that my sister was more insistent than ever that I should go early with her and the groom. Although I didn't want to, I gave in out of courtesy and joined the initial group. When we arrived, I quickly realized something wasn't right. The room distribution was, to say the least, suspicious. They had booked only 5 rooms, and each one had strategic assignments. My sister and her fiancé would obviously share one. My brother would arrive later with his girlfriend and occupy another, and the rest would be distributed among the groom's friends and some relatives. "Where's my room?" When I asked, my sister just smiled with her most casual tone. "Oh, you'll be sharing with him, of course." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What do you mean I'll be sharing a room with him? Are you crazy?" I snapped. She feigned surprise and told me there was simply no other option. She insisted it was just one night, that we were both adults, and that there was no reason to make a drama out of something so trivial. "Besides, it's your ex, not a stranger," she added, as if that made it less disturbing. I flatly refused, and after an awkward argument, I managed to get them to assign me a sofa in the main room to sleep on. It wasn't ideal, but I preferred that to spending the night under the same roof as someone who not only represented a closed chapter in my life, but had also been a source of so much stress and manipulation. That night, as I tried to sleep on the sofa, I heard laughter coming from upstairs. My sister, apparently in a state of pre-wedding euphoria, had organized a small improvised party with her fiancé and some close friends. I stayed downstairs, on my phone, talking to my boyfriend to distract myself. That's when my ex appeared, with a drink in his hand and that smile that used to seem charming, but now just found irritating. "Can we talk?" he asked in a voice that pretended to be conciliatory. My answer was firm. "I have nothing to say to you." I stood up and walked to the kitchen to avoid any conversation, but he followed me, trying to insist that there was still something between us. It was as if my refusal had no weight with him. When I finally managed to get rid of him and return to the sofa, I was so emotionally exhausted that I could barely sleep. The next morning, I confronted my sister. "What kind of joke is this? Did you really think that? I thought that if you gave yourselves a chance to talk, things could be fixed. Come on, it's your ex, you can't just erase him from your life." That was enough for me. I told her that if she ever tried something like that again, I would leave the wedding and never speak to her again. She tried to laugh and downplay it, but I knew she was upset that her plans hadn't gone as expected. I decided to stay at the wedding for the sake of my family and to avoid unnecessary drama, but the bad taste left by the previous night wouldn't go away. The following morning, as I was helping my sister with the preparations, she tried to act as if nothing had happened. "Did you sleep well?" she asked with a smile that, by then, I found completely fake. I decided not to answer. I knew that any comment from me would only fuel another argument that I preferred to avoid. The day progressed, and although I tried to focus on my duties as maid of honor, I felt a constant buzz of discomfort. My ex was always in the background, like a shadow, trying to start conversations and looking at me every time he thought I didn't notice. My sister, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy watching him try to get close to me. The real explosion happened that night, during the pre-wedding party. It was a combination of bachelor/bachelorette party and a sort of early reception for the closest guests. The place was decorated with warm lights, the lively music resonated, and there was a general feeling of joy in the air. Everyone seemed to be enjoying it, except me. My sister, true to her style, had combined the groups of friends from both sides of the family, making sure that my ex and I ended up in the same circle. During dinner, I resigned myself to maintaining my composure and avoiding any confrontation, but it wasn't long before he tried to start a conversation with me in front of everyone. You know, I've always thought we made a mistake by breaking up, he said out of nowhere, in a tone that clearly sought everyone's attention. The eyes of those present turned to us, and I felt the air grow heavier. I tried to ignore him, but he continued. I still think about everything we planned together, and I think we could try again. It was at that moment that I decided enough was enough. There's nothing to try, I replied in as calm a voice as possible. Our time together is in the past, and I'm happy with my current life. The discomfort at the table was palpable. My sister quickly intervened, laughing nervously. Come on, you don't have to get so serious. It's just a conversation between friends. But for me, this wasn't a conversation. It was a full-blown emotional ambush. After dinner, while trying to escape the tense atmosphere, my sister intercepted me near the bar. I can't believe you're so cold, she said in a tone that mixed reproach and frustration. He really loves you. Don't you see how hard he's tried? Tried what? I replied, unable to contain myself. To make me feel guilty about a decision I made years ago? To manipulate me into getting back with someone who clearly doesn't respect my boundaries? This isn't love, it's obsession, and I'm not going to tolerate it anymore. She looked at me incredulously, as if she couldn't understand why I didn't share her enthusiasm for her idea of a perfect family. She tried to calm me down by saying she only wanted the best for me. But by then her idea of what was best was so far removed from reality that I couldn't contain my anger. Later that night, the real chaos erupted. I was in the main room talking on the phone with my boyfriend, telling him what had happened, when my ex suddenly appeared. He was visibly drunk, staggering towards me with a drink in his hand. Are you talking to him? He asked, pointing at my phone. Before I could answer, he continued. Why are you still with someone who doesn't deserve you? You know I'm better for you. I hung up the call immediately, but not before hearing my boyfriend ask worriedly, what's going on? I tried to remain calm, but my ex got closer, invading my personal space. Just give me one more chance, he insisted, his voice mixed with pleading and frustration. Enough, I finally shouted, losing my patience. Leave me alone. What part of I don't want anything to do with you don't you understand? The scene caught the attention of everyone at the party. My sister came running, with a mixture of confusion and anger on her face. Instead of addressing him, she looked at me. What are you doing causing a scene at my party? I responded indignantly. Are you really going to blame me when he's the one who doesn't understand what it means to respect boundaries? This is your fault for continuing to force him into my life. She tried to justify it by saying they were just trying to help, but I had no more patience for her excuses. I went straight to my room and started packing my things. I wasn't going to stay another second in that place. When my sister followed me, still trying to convince me to stay, I said something I knew would hurt. If this is what you call being a sister, then I'd rather not have one. The next morning, while the rest of the guests were getting ready for the ceremony, I was in my car, driving back home. On the way home, still filled with anger, I wondered how I had gotten to this point with my sister. Before all of this, we were close. Sure, she'd always had that dominant personality, that tendency to want to control everything, but I never thought she'd go so far as to manipulate my life to fulfill her vision of a perfect family. As I was driving, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Calls from my sister, messages from my parents, even a couple of notifications from my ex. I ignored them all. I didn't go straight home. I went to my boyfriend's house. He already knew something had happened, but when I told him the details of the party, his face went from worry to fury. This has gone too far, he said, his voice firm. I can't believe they're still acting like they have the right to decide about your life. We're going to put an end to this. As much as I didn't want to worry my parents, I knew I'd eventually have to explain my absence at the wedding. So, after a couple of days of silence, I called my mother. At first, she tried to downplay the situation. Your sister didn't mean any harm. You know how she is? She's always been a bit impulsive, she said, as if that justified everything. Impulsive? I replied, my voice laced with disbelief. Mom, she made me share a room with my ex, put me in uncomfortable situations over and over again, and she doesn't even respect my current relationship. This isn't being impulsive, it's being manipulative. My mother sighed, as if she was tired of having to deal with a problem that, for her, wasn't that serious. But what really surprised me was what she said next. Well, you know she just wants the best for you. Maybe you should consider it from her point of view. What if he really is still in love with you? That was a low blow. It was as if everyone around me was more interested in fulfilling my sister's fantasy than in respecting my autonomy. I hung up before I said something I might regret. The days passed, and although I tried to move on, I couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and sadness. My boyfriend was incredibly supportive during that time, but it was also clear that the situation was beginning to affect him. I can't stand to see how they treat you, he told me one night. Your family should be your refuge, not the source of all this stress. The tension increased when, a few weeks later, I started receiving strange messages from an unknown number. At first, they were vague, phrases like, I know what you're doing, or some people never change. I ignored them, thinking maybe it was some kind of spam. But then the photos arrived. They were pictures of me with my ex, apparently taken during private moments. Some showed situations that had never happened, romantic embraces, a supposed date at a restaurant, even one where it looked like we were about to kiss. I knew they were fake, clearly manipulated, but the level of detail was disturbing. I showed the messages to my boyfriend, who, to my relief, didn't doubt me for a second. This is the work of someone who knows you well, he said with a serious look. Who else would have access to photos of you with your ex? We immediately thought of my sister. Although I didn't want to believe she could stoop to that level of cruelty, everything pointed to her. We decided to go to the police and report the messages as harassment and misuse of personal images. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew it was necessary. When we filed the report, the authorities began tracking the source of the messages. Meanwhile, I received a call from my sister. Her tone was forcefully friendly, as if nothing had happened. How are you? I've been thinking about you. Why don't you come home this weekend? We could talk and clear things up. I confronted her directly. Why don't you tell me what's going on? Because if it turns out those messages are yours, there's nothing to talk about. Her response was an uncomfortable silence before she hastily changed the subject. That's when I knew she was involved. A few days later, the police called me with an update. The messages came from an IP address linked to my sister's home. The impact of that confirmation was devastating. She had not only ignored my boundaries, but she had crossed an ethical and illegal line. When I confronted her, she initially denied everything, but when I mentioned that the police had evidence, she broke down in tears. I just wanted you to see that you still care, she said, as if that was a justification. If you didn't care, you wouldn't have been so bothered. That was the last straw. My patience ran out, and I made it clear that she was officially out of my life. My parents tried to mediate, saying that I shouldn't be so drastic, but there was no going back. As I left their house that day, I felt a mix of relief and pain. I had lost my sister, but I had also regained control over my life. After cutting all ties with my sister, I went through an emotional roller coaster. On one hand, I felt immense relief knowing that I wouldn't have to deal with her manipulations and constant interference in my life anymore. But, on the other hand, it hurt deeply to lose that connection with someone who had been such an important figure during my childhood. The relationship with my parents also remained strained. Although they didn't support what my sister had done, they still tried to minimize her actions, as if they were simple mistakes and not a pattern of toxic behavior. I decided to focus on my life with my boyfriend, who by then had become my fiancé. We had talked about getting married simply, without the spectacle and problems that had left me so emotionally drained after my sister's wedding. We wanted something intimate, only with the people who truly supported and respected us. My parents, although initially hurt by the idea of a small wedding, eventually accepted it. They knew that, after everything that had happened, I had the right to do things my way. However, the drama with my sister didn't end there. A month before our wedding, I started receiving insistent calls and messages from her. At first I ignored them, but eventually she sent a long message that left me speechless. In it, she tried to justify everything she had done, saying she had only acted out of love and that her intention had never been to harm me. She also asked me for a chance to reconcile, saying she couldn't bear the thought of not being present at my wedding. Although her words seemed sincere, I couldn't forget what had happened. I replied clearly and directly. It's not my responsibility to repair a relationship that you yourself destroyed. I need to protect my peace and happiness, and for now that means staying away from you. It was a difficult decision, but a necessary one. I wasn't willing to let her presence ruin another important moment in my life. Our wedding was everything I had dreamed of, small, intimate, and filled with genuine love. My brother traveled from abroad to be present, and seeing his support gave me the strength to move forward. My parents attended, although I noticed a certain sadness in their eyes knowing that my sister wasn't there. They also seemed to finally understand that there were boundaries that couldn't be crossed. At the end of the ceremony, as I looked at my husband and felt the warmth of our united families, the ones that really mattered, I understood that I had made the right decision. Family doesn't always mean blood. It means support, respect, and mutual love, something that, unfortunately, my sister had not been able to offer me. But the story didn't end there. A few months after the wedding, I received an unexpected call from my brother-in-law, my sister's husband. I was surprised to hear his voice. We hadn't spoken since all the wedding drama. His tone was serious and concerned. He told me that my sister was going through a difficult time and that she wanted to meet with me to apologize in person. At first, my instinct was to reject the idea. I didn't want to open a door I had closed with so much effort. But, after thinking about it, I decided I wouldn't lose anything by listening to her, as long as I set clear boundaries. We met at a neutral coffee shop, in a place where I knew I could leave at any time if things got out of control. When she arrived, I immediately noticed that something had changed. She no longer had that dominant attitude or that fake smile. She looked tired, vulnerable, and her voice trembled when she began to speak. I know I have no right to ask this of you, but I want you to listen to me, she said, looking directly into my eyes. What I did was wrong, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I remained silent for a moment, trying to process her words. She continued explaining how her obsession with the idea of a perfect family had blinded her, and how she had begun to realize the damage she had caused, not only to me, but also to her own marriage. I lost a lot by not listening to the people who mattered most, she confessed with tears in her eyes. Although her words touched me, I knew I couldn't just forget everything that had happened. I told her that I appreciated her apology, but that I needed time to consider whether we could rebuild anything. I want to believe you're being sincere, I said, but I also need to protect my happiness. For now, I want you to respect my space. We said goodbye, and although there were no hugs or promises of immediate reconciliation, I felt like I had taken a step forward. I didn't know if I could ever fully trust her again, but at least I could close that chapter with the peace of mind of knowing that I had done everything possible to heal. Story 2. My dad surprised me with a trip abroad for my 18th birthday, but my stepmother and her daughter sabotaged everything the day before, and he took his revenge. My father and I are very close. We've always been a team, especially since my mom passed away when I was still a little girl. I was too young to fully process her death, but as I grew up, I felt her absence immensely. My dad was my unconditional support. He went out of his way to make me laugh, to teach me that life went on, and that we should honor my mom's memory by being happy in our own way. However, after several years, my dad wanted to rebuild his love life, and I don't judge him for it. We all need companionship, and he was too young to be alone. So when I was around 13, he started dating a woman who, at the time, seemed very kind. Later, she and her daughter, a year younger than me, moved in with us to our house in a coastal state of the United States. Although my paternal grandparents have always lived in the north, several hours away by car, my father has remained in this location for his work. At first, I could swear that everything was going relatively well. My stepmother and her daughter made plans with me, asked me things about school, and even my hobbies. I really liked drawing, but little by little, after some time passed and the relationship was formalized with a wedding, the dynamic changed. I began to notice that, when my dad wasn't around, they spoke to me with a certain disdain. Eye rolls, short answers, and criticisms disguised as advice. For example, they told me I was too intense with my hobbies or that my way of dressing was too simple. For a good while, I assumed that maybe this was normal and that I was just being paranoid. I was afraid to tell my dad because I didn't want to ruin his new marriage. I was hoping things would flow and settle down. But when I turned 15, I couldn't take it anymore, and I told him. I remember that time I had to show my dad an audio recording I had made of my stepmother scolding me for no reason, yelling at me for not cleaning the kitchen, even though I already had. My dad confronted my stepmother and her daughter, and they became very defensive. They argued that I was becoming sensitive and that I couldn't handle constructive criticism. Then they cried, saying that I was misinterpreting them. And well, my dad ended up asking all of us to try to live together in peace. All we achieved was an uncomfortable truce. In my dad's presence, they pretended to be cordial. When he wasn't around, they ignored me or spoke to me in monosyllables. This is how the last 2 years went by. I learned to focus on my studies, my friends, and my own goals so I wouldn't go crazy. I almost had no direct conflicts with them because I avoided confrontation myself. I came to believe that, as long as they didn't interfere in my life, everything would work in a minimally acceptable way. Now, the most relevant part. My 18th birthday was just around the corner, and my dad planned a huge surprise. He prepared a modest party for me at home, to which my best friends and some relatives came. At the gathering, just at the moment of singing Happy Birthday, my dad announced that, as a gift, we had a 10-day trip abroad planned. It was something I had dreamed of doing since I was a child, and for my father it was also a very special longing, because my mom, when she was alive, used to talk about wanting to visit that faraway destination. I will never forget my reaction. I was speechless. Then, I let out a scream and ran to hug my dad. Everyone was clapping and congratulating me. I couldn't believe it. I felt my heart racing with excitement. But when I glanced at my stepmother and her daughter, I noticed that they had their arms crossed and were looking at the floor. Zero enthusiasm. In fact, they went to the kitchen before the applause ended, and that's when I knew immediately that something was cooking and not dinner. Later, when most of the guests had left, I overheard my father arguing with my stepmother in a low voice. She reproached him for not including them on such an important trip, and that if she had planned something for her daughter, she would never have left him out. My stomach churned with nerves. From the living room, I just looked out the window and pretended not to hear. My father defended himself by telling her that she had work commitments, her daughter was in the middle of final exams, and that, besides, this trip had a very deep meaning for me and him, as a tribute to my mom. I don't want to sound selfish, but the truth is that I was enormously grateful that they weren't coming. When they have traveled together, mother and daughter, to nearby resorts or have gone on weekend getaways, they have never included me. Also, I'm very aware of how they behave on vacation. They spend their time locked up in the hotel or complaining if you want to go for a walk and see new things. My dad and I are more adventurous. We walk, we explore, we like to try the local cuisine and immerse ourselves in the culture. I'm convinced that if they had come, the trip would have turned into a nightmare of complaints and restrictions. That night, I went to bed with mixed feelings. On the one hand, I was excited about the trip. I was finally going to leave the country with my dad. On the other hand, I felt a little guilty. Was it really okay to leave them out? But my father had explained everything to me, and I trusted him. I fell asleep with the conviction that nothing and no one would ruin my dream. However, things took an unexpected turn the next day. I couldn't imagine the level of resentment my stepmother and her daughter could reach. I got up early, had breakfast with my dad, and then he went out to buy some sandals and sunscreen. It was going to be hot in that country. I stayed home checking my suitcase and preparing the necessary documents for the trip. And that's when the unthinkable happened. My passport disappeared. I looked everywhere for it. I checked my desk, my nightstand, the living room, the kitchen, even the bathroom. Nothing. I texted my dad asking if, for some reason, he had taken it, but he replied that he hadn't. I started to get very nervous and checked absurd places, like the laundry room, in case I had left it on top of the dryer. Nothing. Almost an hour passed until I heard my stepmother and her daughter calling me in sweet little voices from the living room. Is something wrong? Why are you so desperate? My stepmother's daughter said in a tone that sent shivers down my spine. I froze when I heard them call me with such fake voices. I was right in the middle of searching for my passport, which was still missing, and I immediately began to suspect that they might have something to do with it. So I cautiously went down to the living room. There they were, my stepmother and her daughter looking at me with a little smile that chilled my blood. You look upset. Are you okay? Asked my stepmother's daughter in an almost mocking tone, as if enjoying my worry. I'm looking for my passport, I replied as firmly as I could. Have you seen it by any chance? At that moment, my stepmother raised an eyebrow and feigned surprise. She made an exaggerated "oh" gesture and suddenly pulled something out from behind her back, a small blackened lump that she threw onto the small table in the hallway. My heart leaped with pure horror as I recognized the shape and dimensions of it. My passport, or what was left of it. The document was burned at several corners, and the rest was scorched beyond recognition. The plastic cover had melted, and my photo, the one where I looked nervous because it was taken in the middle of my adolescence, was no longer distinguishable. There was a mark of intentional fire. It didn't look like an accident at all. I was speechless for a few seconds, processing what I had in front of me. My stepmother and her daughter looked at each other and then let out a short laugh. It wasn't a loud guffaw or anything very noticeable, but that hiss of satisfaction confirmed to me that they had done it on purpose. If I was sure of anything at that moment, it was that my trip was ruined. A passport in that state wasn't going to help me leave the country, let alone do express paperwork a day before taking a flight. Oops, what a shame, said the daughter with all the falseness in the world. Looks like you had an unfortunate spontaneous fire. Yes, what a coincidence, added my stepmother, covering her mouth with feigned compassion. That was a low blow, an act I never thought they would do even in their worst arguments with me. I felt a lump in my throat and the urge to cry right there, but I decided I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. I took a deep breath, picked up what was left of my passport, being careful not to stain my hands with soot, and turned around to go up to my room without saying a word. Once in my room, I locked the door and threw myself on the bed. There, I burst into tears. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and furious. How could they be so cruel? What kind of people was I living with? I spent a few minutes not knowing what to do, while my mind raced thinking about the trip and what my dad would say when he found out. He had worked so long to give me this gift, and in less than 24 hours it had become a bad joke. I took my cell phone and sent a message to my dad to come back immediately. I attached a photo of the destroyed passport, trying to describe what had happened, even though my hands were shaking. I felt a tingle of pure rage, that contained rage that you don't know whether to scream, break something, or simply freeze. He didn't answer me. Time seemed eternal, although I think it actually took him less than half an hour to arrive. I heard him enter the house as he slammed the door shut. I went down the stairs with half my strength, still shaky, and I found the scene. My father yelling like I'd never seen him do before. He was saying things like, "How dare you treat my daughter like this? And get out of my house if you can't respect her." His face was red with anger. My stepmother and her daughter, on the other hand, were crying and muttering some excuse as absurd as that I had left a lit cigarette near the passport and that the fire started accidentally. My father looked at me waiting for confirmation of that version, but I shook my head, totally incredulous at that lie. For starters, I don't even smoke. They know that. When in your life have you seen your daughter smoke? My father snapped at my stepmother, almost spitting out the words. My stepmother didn't know what to answer. On the contrary, she started babbling incoherently like, I don't know, maybe she was doing it secretly, or what if she was experimenting? Everything sounded ridiculous, and my dad was in no mood to give any truce. He went to his office, a small room on the ground floor where he keeps his documents, and came back with some papers in his hand. I saw my stepmother's daughter's face turn pale, as if she knew what was coming next. To my surprise, my father handed those papers to the daughter and said, "Do you recognize this? Did you need it?" "No." "Well, forget about me signing it." Seeing the look of anguish on her face, my dad did something even more radical. He tore the documents in front of her. I was in shock. Later, I found out that they were the student loan papers that he had offered to co-sign to help his stepdaughter pay for college. "How can you do this to my daughter?" shouted my stepmother, still crying. "And how could you destroy my daughter's trip?" my dad replied without hesitation. "This is the least you deserve." In a burst of determination, my father demanded that they leave the house immediately. The question going through my head was, is he really going to kick them out? Just like that. But my dad was implacable. He even gave them a deadline. "You have 1 hour to pack your essentials and get out. Do it, or I'll call the police." My stepmother's daughter wanted to apologize to me. She begged me to intercede so that my dad wouldn't leave her without financial support. She argued that they did it out of a fit of jealousy, that they thought I was excluding them from everything. But, frankly, after such a low blow, I had no energy left to feel sorry. I told her that I wouldn't lift a finger to help them, that they had crossed an unforgivable line. While they were packing their things, I locked myself in my room again. I could hear the commotion downstairs, suitcases opening and closing, slamming doors, the murmur of insults they were saying to each other. My dad, meanwhile, stayed in the living room with a serious face, checking his phone or simply waiting for them to finish taking their belongings. Once they left, the house was left in a silence that felt strange, almost unreal, as if a tornado had passed and suddenly left the atmosphere stagnant. I looked out onto the ground floor and found my father sitting on the sofa with his face buried in his hands. I approached him quietly and gave him a hug. We didn't talk. There was no need. We both knew that life had just changed completely. When he finally broke the silence, he looked at me with tired eyes and said, "I'm sorry. I should have stopped this sooner." I didn't know what to answer him, because, in part, I blamed him for not having stopped the abuse from my stepmother and her daughter from the beginning. But I didn't want to put more blame on him either. At that moment, it was clear that the relationship was completely broken. What followed was a night of insomnia and sadness. On the one hand, my trip abroad had been canceled. It was impossible to process a new passport overnight, and that hurt me deeply. On the other hand, a strange relief washed over me, as if a darkness that had been brewing for years had finally been removed from the house. I had a lump in my throat, but also a slight hope that things could get better. It was close to midnight when I started getting messages from my stepmother's daughter on my social media. She asked me, almost begging, to intercede with my dad. She said that she needed the co-signature for the college loan, that her own mother didn't have a strong enough credit history, and that her biological father had been unconcerned for years. According to her, she had no right to be left without an education because I was hurt. But what about my dreams? Didn't I have the right to my trip, to my dream of sharing with my dad something we had waited for all our lives? I blocked her without thinking twice, because I knew she would keep insisting. I also blocked my stepmother, who tried to call me a couple of times. She even left me a voicemail crying, saying that she felt devastated, that we all make mistakes, and that she deserved another chance. However, that same day, I saw her laughing in my face with the burned passport in her hand. No, definitely, I wasn't willing to forget just like that. That's how the story of my travel plan ended, for the moment. I went to sleep with my heart in my throat, thinking about what had happened, the expulsion of my stepmother and her daughter from the house, the destroyed passport, and the possible divorce that was looming. Because yes, my dad didn't say it explicitly at that moment, but everything pointed to the fact that there was no turning back. The only thing that consoled me a little was that, despite not being able to travel the next day, my father and I were united. I knew he wouldn't let anyone hurt me like that again. Maybe he would soon find a way to replace my passport and resume our dream of traveling together. The following hours, after that dramatic episode, were a whirlwind of emotions. My dad, visibly affected, asked me to wait for him in the living room while he made a couple of urgent calls. He shut himself in his office, and although I couldn't hear most of the conversation, at times I heard him raise his voice in frustration. Even so, I felt that much of his anger was not only with my stepmother and her daughter, but also with himself for having allowed things to get to that point. Meanwhile, I remained on the living room sofa, looking at the charred passport that I had left on the coffee table. Seeing it produced in me a mixture of deep sadness and contained rage. That feeling of helplessness kept swirling around me. On the one hand, they had blown up my dream trip. On the other, they had shown that they were capable of acting with a cruelty that I could not comprehend. Because one thing was to endure hurtful comments or snubs, but destroying a document so valuable and important to me was unacceptable. The silence of the house felt strange, almost as if it still carried the tension that was there when my stepmother and her daughter packed their bags and left. Every time I remembered their last-minute pleas, with her, the daughter, crying for me to intercede for the loan signature, my blood boiled. A few hours earlier, they had made fun of me with that burned passport, and now they wanted my help. I couldn't assimilate so much hypocrisy. After a long while, my dad came out of his office. He looked grim, but upon seeing me, he let out a sigh and sat down next to me. putting an arm around my shoulders. We didn't have to say anything at first. Our gestures said it all. After a minute of silence, he explained that he had called a lawyer he had known for some years. Not a close friend, but someone he trusted, to consult him about the possibility of a divorce. I already suspected it, but hearing it from his own mouth gave me a slight chill. I don't want this to continue. Not after what they did to you, he said with a broken voice. I know I should have been firmer, or even avoided getting to this point. But at least I want you to know that, from now on, I don't intend to let my guard down again. I understand, I replied softly. Thank you for defending me. I hugged him, and I felt that, for the first time in a long time, the weight I was carrying was lightening a bit. Because if anything good came out of this chaos, it was the reaffirmation that my dad and I were still a solid team, despite the mistakes he might have made in the past. I wasn't ready to forgive the fact that, on more than one occasion, he minimized my complaints against my stepmother and her daughter, but I didn't want to focus on reproaches either. We had enough to deal with everything that was coming. That night, I made myself some dinner, a simple sandwich, because I wasn't in the mood to cook, and watched a movie on TV to distract myself. I couldn't concentrate. My head was full of unanswered questions. What would happen if my dad definitely got divorced? Would we have to divide the house or sell it? Would we have to see my stepmother frequently for legal procedures? Or worse, could she try to find a loophole to harm us? At times I wondered if the most sensible thing to do was to pack my things and go live with my paternal grandparents, who had always supported me. They lived in another state and had told me 1,000 times that their door was open for me if I ever couldn't stand the situation. However, I also felt that it was my responsibility to stay with my dad and support him through this process, especially now that I saw so clearly the sacrifice he was making for me. The idea of leaving him alone in the middle of the divorce didn't seem fair to me. The next day, in the morning, my dad woke me up by gently knocking on my door. He brought a light breakfast, coffee and scrambled eggs with toast. He sat on the edge of my bed and said, I talked to the airline. In the end, we'll miss the flight, and the cost is not fully refundable. But at least I'll be able to change the date with an extra charge. Don't worry, this won't stay like this. We're going to renew your passport as soon as possible, and even if it takes a few months, we'll go on that trip. I promise. That comforted me a lot. We made more concrete plans. First, I had to arrange an appointment to apply for a new passport. Then, my dad would try to reorganize his days off at work to be able to travel on another date, probably in a few weeks or maybe a couple of months. I didn't lose hope. That dream of seeing another country, and especially that destination that meant so much because of my mom's memory, gave me strength to endure the current disappointment. The rest of the week passed in pause mode. The house felt big and silent, even though neither my stepmother nor her daughter contributed much to the coexistence. My dad was talking to his lawyer and also to a couple of friends, getting advice on how to proceed. For my part, I started reviewing the passport renewal requirements and filling out online forms. I even went to the room that my stepmother's daughter used to share and checked, just in case, if my original document hadn't been thrown in there. However destroyed it was, I wanted to see if there was anything left that would help us prove to the authorities that it was an act of vandalism. But I found nothing but ash and burned paper in a small trash can. During those days, I received multiple anonymous messages on my social networks. I suspect they came from my stepmother's daughter with fake accounts, where she wrote things like, "Someday you'll regret what you did," or "We'll see who laughs last." Her resentment was palpable. At first, I was a little scared, thinking that she might take more violent reprisals. But my dad assured me that if anything happened, he would not hesitate to contact the police and even press charges. That stance calmed me down somewhat, although I couldn't help feeling a knot in my stomach. To distract myself, I went back to my routines. I started running in the mornings, resumed drawing classes at a nearby studio, and forced myself to go out with my friends at least a couple of times a week. Little by little, the memory of the burned passport stopped being an open wound and became another reason to close that bitter chapter with my stepmother and her daughter. About 5 days later, my dad and I had what we could call the definitive talk. He asked me to go with him for a drive to a large park on the outskirts of our city. There, sitting on a bench, he confessed that he had formally started the divorce process. He said that he wasn't going to back down and that he had the advice of his lawyer to counteract any lies my stepmother might invent. It was at that moment that I finally felt real relief. as if the weight of years of bad vibes and tension had finally been lifted from my chest. "I know you'll have a lot of questions," my dad said softly. "Ask whatever you want. I'm willing to be honest. I owe you that." I looked at him, and the only question that came to mind was, "Do you think you can be happy after this?" He sighed, ran a hand through his hair, and replied something I won't forget. "I won't be totally happy until I see that you are at peace. And that includes regaining our dream of traveling, of laughing together. We'll see what happens, daughter. But for now, I need to sort out the legal chaos." I nodded. There wasn't much more to say. We had a long road ahead of us, but at least there was no longer any doubt that we were going to face it together. And, with a little luck, we were going to come out of this with a new passport, a rescheduled trip, and without those two people who had hurt us so much. I thought that once the divorce proceedings began, everything would be relatively calm, but I was wrong. As soon as the legal process began, my father encountered a series of tricks from my stepmother that I could hardly believe. During the first 2 weeks after our definitive talk in the park, my father told me, in a somewhat measured way, everything that was happening. On the one hand, she began to bombard him with threatening messages and calls. She even accused him of abandonment, saying that he had left the house, which was a lie, because the truth is that she left voluntarily with her daughter after our last confrontation. On the other hand, she insinuated that she was thinking of suing him for alleged debts that he, according to her, had never covered. Among her nonsense, she claimed that my father owed her money for household expenses and even for having taken care of me during those years, as if she had done it of her own free will and not because, in theory, she was trying to build a family. My father, although furious, tried to remain calm. His lawyer advised him not to respond to the messages impulsively and to save any conversation or evidence that she was lying. He explained to me that in divorce cases, sometimes the one who shouts the loudest or tries to tarnish the other's reputation can gain an advantage, especially if the judge or the authorities do not have all the information. My dad, far from being an expert, followed his lawyer's advice to the letter. I, for my part, began to notice small changes in our daily routine that confirmed to me that this woman was not going to give up so easily. For example, notes began to appear on the front door, some anonymous, others in her handwriting, where they insulted me and blamed me for destroying their marriage. They said things like, "Happy to keep everything," or "Your dad has spoiled you so much that you don't know what it is to suffer." I tried not to read them, but curiosity was stronger than me. After taking a look at them, I would tear them up and throw them in the trash. One afternoon, when my dad and I were returning from the supermarket, we were unpleasantly surprised to find that someone had scratched his truck with a sharp object, leaving an ugly scratch in the paint on the driver's side. We had no proof that it had been my stepmother or her daughter, but the coincidence was too much. My dad reported the incident to the police, more to have a record in case more aggressions accumulated than because he expected them to do much. It was frustrating to feel vulnerable. Even with all this, the process of my passport continued its course. We managed to get an appointment relatively soon for the renewal, although we had to travel to another city, almost 2 hours away, because in ours, the offices were saturated. I remember that my dad took the day off, accompanied me to take my picture and deliver all the necessary documentation to process it. It was a tense day, but at the same time symbolic. I felt that with every signature I gave, I was one step closer to regaining my dream of traveling. While all this was happening, there was no shortage of attempts by my stepmother's daughter to contact me. She created several fake accounts to harass me on social media. At first, I blocked them immediately, but then I realized that maybe these messages could serve as evidence of harassment if the situation escalated. So I chose to save them in a folder and write down the dates. It was my father's own lawyer who suggested that gathering evidence, rather than simply ignoring the situation, could be useful in court. Still, it was emotionally draining. Meanwhile, my life was moving on. I had finished my paperwork to apply to college and was waiting for responses. I had acceptance letters in process, and I was excited about the idea of starting this new stage. I consoled myself by thinking about the future, about maybe moving to a campus where I could breathe a healthier environment, free of bad energy. However, I was also burdened by the idea of leaving my dad alone facing the divorce, since I knew how much it hurt him. At night, we sometimes sat down to dinner and talked about simple things so as not to overwhelm ourselves. One day, While we were eating pizza in the living room, we didn't even feel like setting the table. My dad confessed something to me. "I've been thinking about selling the house," he suddenly said in a subdued voice. "There are too many memories here, too much tension. Everyone knows where we live. Maybe it would be good for us to start over somewhere else." The idea surprised me. That house was not only the scene of so many recent conflicts, but also the place where I grew up and shared many beautiful moments with my dad and, years ago, with my biological mom. Nostalgia washed over me, and I even felt like crying. But I understood where his proposal was coming from. It was true that, in that city, my stepmother, or ex-stepmother, depending on how you looked at it, had friends and acquaintances who could easily locate us. And if she or her daughter insisted on continuing to bother us, maybe we were exposed to more attacks. "Are you sure?" I asked him with a lump in my throat. "And your job?" "And my grandparents are several hours away from here." "I haven't decided completely," he replied, shrugging his shoulders. "But I'm considering it. Maybe not right now, but later on, depending on how things turn out. I want us to be at peace." I listened to him carefully. I, too, had been toying with the idea of going to live with my grandparents or in a college dorm, so I understood that need for change. However, the house was not something so easy to let go of for me. I grew up there. I had so many memories. But if, in the end, it turned out that staying was dangerous or too painful, maybe a new beginning somewhere else did make sense. The divorce progressed. My dad's ex-partner filed absurd complaints and allegations every now and then. My dad, calmly, responded and gathered evidence that she was lying. On one occasion, she claimed that my father had hidden properties and bank accounts in his name, something totally false. My dad's lawyer had to present financial documentation to show that none of this existed. Fortunately, thanks to the investigation, every lie ended up entangling her more and weakening her credibility before the judge. While everything was happening, my stepmother's daughter, without my father's financial support, was facing difficulties with her student loan. I learned, through a mutual friend, because, of course, my stepmother's daughter and I shared some acquaintances from high school, that she was desperate and that her biological father refused to help her. Somehow, I felt a bit of compassion for her situation, but then I remembered the image of my passport burning, her mocking little laugh, and the supposed coincidence of the cigarette that never existed. It was impossible to forgive her completely. Still, that part of me that sought inner peace wanted to think that maybe, someday, she would understand the damage she caused me. But I didn't feel like talking to her or helping her out. I simply wished her, from a distance, that she would learn something from the consequences of her actions. In that context, our daily life was summarized in waiting and preparation. Waiting for the divorce to be resolved, waiting for the arrival of my new passport, and, in my free time, preparing my college applications. My dad, on the other hand, worked long hours to make sure he had enough funds to cover any unexpected expenses from the separation. From time to time, we would take a break and go see a movie at the drive-in or walk along the shore of a nearby lake when the weather allowed it. They were our little escapes to remind ourselves that we could still smile and that not everything in life was drama. Best of all was that determination my dad repeated every time he saw me discouraged. "The trip is not canceled, daughter, just postponed." And I believed him. Maybe, for the first time in weeks, I was starting to feel that we would really smile again on a plane, ready for an adventure on another continent, honoring my mom's memory and closing forever the chapter of that domestic hell that I had endured for so many years with my stepmother and her daughter. One morning, about 2 weeks after the incidents I had been recounting in the previous part, my dad arrived home with an expression that, at first, I couldn't decipher. He had left earlier than usual and hadn't told me where he was going. When I saw him come through the door, carrying a folder and with a gesture between tired and relieved, I knew he had important news. He put his things on the table and asked me to sit down. I took a deep breath, preparing myself mentally for any news related to the divorce. However, what he said took me by surprise. "Your new passport is ready. I picked it up today at the main office, the one in the next city. They called me last night to let me know it had arrived." My reaction was almost childish. I jumped for joy and ran to hug him. I didn't know that the process would end that very day. I assumed it would take a little longer, but the emotion immediately overwhelmed me. I finally had my passport again. That, in itself, was a symbol of hope that my dad and I could resume our pending trip. However, my dad asked me to remain calm, because we still had several legal loose ends to tie up. Although having my passport was a big step, we had to see how the divorce and the general situation ended before venturing to buy new plane tickets. Also, with my dad's work and my college paperwork, we probably wouldn't be able to travel immediately. But the simple fact of having my document in hand gave me back the hope I had lost. As I held that brand new passport, I remembered the ashes of the previous one, that infamous day when my stepmother and her daughter burned it without a second thought. I shivered, because it was an act that abruptly broke any possibility of family life. But, in a way, it served as an impetus for me to turn the page and start a new chapter in my life. From then on, the following weeks brought a series of events. First, my dad attended several appointments with his lawyer, and finally, the date was set for a hearing where some key points of the divorce would be decided, including the division of assets and the resolution of any claims my stepmother made against him. I knew that they were going to put up all possible obstacles, claiming that my dad had left them on the street and a lot of other lies. But my father was well prepared. He had messages, evidence of harassment, police reports about the vandalism of the truck, recordings that demonstrated the threats, etc. The day of the hearing arrived. I decided to accompany him to give him moral support, although I knew that I would not have to testify or anything like that, unless it was strictly necessary. I sat in a corner of the room while my dad, his lawyer, my stepmother, and her lawyer faced the judge. I couldn't hear everything clearly, but I could glimpse snippets of the discussion. She insisted that she had been a victim of abandonment, accused my dad of being a manipulator, and even tried to label him as violent. None of that fit with reality. My dad has always been a quiet, hard-working man. If he had done anything wrong, it was taking too long to cut that toxic relationship at the root. The judge, fortunately, seemed skeptical of my stepmother's statements, especially when my dad and his lawyer presented evidence of the text messages where my stepmother threatened to defame him if he didn't give in to her demands. The police report of the scratch on the truck and a long list of incidents were also presented. The offensive notes on the door, the burned passport, with photos showing the level of destruction, and some short audios where my stepmother and her daughter were mocking. I shuddered when I saw those records, but at the same time, I felt relieved that the judge knew about them. Finally, after listening to the parties for a few hours, the judge ruled, provisionally, pending the full sentence, that there was no reason to grant any kind of support to my stepmother. Neither would the alleged claim for household expenses or anything similar proceed, because, legally, there were no solid grounds to support those demands. My dad, obviously, couldn't contain a gesture of satisfaction as he left the room, while my stepmother showed a face of anger mixed with frustration. As she passed by me, she gave me a look of hatred that gave me goosebumps, but I didn't care anymore. I knew that her days of manipulation were numbered. Days later, my dad and I continued with our normal routine. He, however, had a strange mix of feelings. On the one hand, he was excited to have taken a definitive step towards freedom and away from that toxic relationship. On the other hand, he felt guilty for having allowed me to suffer for so long. Still, I tried to be understanding. I knew that none of this had been easy for him, let alone premeditated. At home, we started making some changes to make it feel more like ours. We removed old furniture that belonged to my stepmother, painted the living room a different color, and even rearranged certain decorations that brought back bad memories. It was a way of exorcising the ghosts that had haunted the home. Little by little, I felt more comfortable. I was no longer terrified of returning home or finding threatening messages on the door. On the other hand, my stepmother's daughter was quite busy trying to salvage her admission to university. Several acquaintances told me that she was begging her own biological father to co-sign a loan for her, but he, apparently, remained firm that if she wanted to study, she should look for scholarships or state support. On social media, accounts with sporadic insults continued to appear, but they were becoming less frequent. It seemed that the initial fury had given way to resignation, or that she finally understood that she wasn't going to achieve anything by harassing me. As the divorce became clearer, my father returned to the idea of selling the house to move. Although it wasn't certain yet, we discussed it at times. He asked me if, upon entering university, I would prefer to stay in a dormitory or in an apartment near campus. I was attracted to the independence of living in a student residence, although I knew that it would leave my dad quite alone. On the other hand, if he also wanted to move, it was possible that the move would coincide with the start of my university life. Everything was up in the air, and at the same time, everything felt lighter. It was as if, by getting rid of the people who poisoned our daily lives, the rest of the paths opened up more clearly. A few weeks after the hearing, an official notification arrived. The judge ruled in my dad's favor on most of the disputes. There were no longer any major obstacles, and the divorce was practically resolved. No alimony, no unfair pensions, no abusive division of assets. The prenuptial agreement they had signed at the time would be respected. The final step would be an appointment for the final signature, and my dad got it at the beginning of that same week. When he gave me the news, I saw him smile in a way I hadn't remembered in years. It was the smile of someone who finally feels free. So, one night, while we were having dinner in the living room, something that became a habit, instead of using the dining room, which reminded us so much of the tensions of before, my dad looked at me with complicity and said, "Ready to revive our dream trip?" I think I was in shock for a couple of seconds, unable to believe that I was finally hearing those words. "Really?" I then replied excitedly. Of course. He explained that, despite everything that had happened, he had managed to save enough to cover the expenses of changing the flight dates and a few more days of lodging, now that the divorce process was over. He had decided to take some days off work and felt it was the perfect time for us to go on vacation before I started university. He was determined not to postpone it any longer. I couldn't help but cry a little. I remembered the first time he told me about the surprise trip when I turned 18 and how my stepmother and her daughter ruined it the day before. It had been a long and chaotic year, but in the end, my dad and I were about to reach our goal. It was true that I wouldn't be traveling with the old passport, full of childhood stamps, with my teenage photo, but with a completely new one. But even that seemed to me a symbol of rebirth. Story 3. My sister thought I was overreacting when I told her I didn't want her ex at my baby shower. So she invited him anyway, and then everything got much worse. To begin with, I'm in the 3rd trimester of my first pregnancy. It's been an emotional journey, between morning sickness and insomnia, but my partner and I are thrilled to welcome our baby. Organizing the baby shower was something I was really looking forward to. I wanted to share that day with the people I love and celebrate what would be the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. From the start, things didn't go as planned. My sister, who is only a year younger than me and with whom I've always had a somewhat complicated relationship, insisted on hosting the event. At first, it seemed like a good idea. Despite our differences, I thought it would be an opportunity to grow closer and strengthen our relationship. But, honestly, I should have seen the red flags from the beginning. My sister has a tendency to ignore boundaries and justify her actions by saying things like, "I just want what's best for you. I do it out of love." But this time, her stubbornness reached a whole new level. It all started when I found out she had invited someone I had specifically asked her not to, her ex-boyfriend. This guy, let's call him M, wasn't just her ex. He was someone who had made our lives hell years ago. They had been in a relationship for over 3 years, full of on-again, off-again cycles, public fights, and drama that inevitably splashed onto the whole family. But the worst was what happened when they finally broke up. M had stalked her for months, showing up unannounced, sending her incessant messages, and causing embarrassing scenes at family gatherings. Although my sister finally got a restraining order against him, she seemed to have developed some kind of emotional Stockholm syndrome, because the following year they started talking again as if nothing had happened. When I found out my sister was considering inviting M, I confronted her directly. I explained that I didn't want him at my baby shower because I knew how uncomfortable it would be for everyone. More importantly, I felt it wouldn't be safe to have him around, especially considering I would be surrounded by my closest friends and family. My sister, as always, minimized my concerns. "That was years ago," she said. "He's changed. Besides, it's not even your problem, it's mine." Despite her words, I thought I had reached an understanding with her. She seemed to understand my position, even promising me she wouldn't invite him, regardless of how she felt about it. The day of the baby shower arrived, and everything seemed to be under control at first. We had rented a small, but cozy, event house in a suburb near Houston, Texas. The decorations were beautiful, with pastel balloons and flowers everywhere. My best friend, who knew how much this day meant to me, had arrived early to make sure everything was perfect. I was excited and eager to see everyone, but I also had that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, like something wasn't quite right. The first sign that something was wrong was my sister's nervous attitude. She avoided looking me directly in the eye and spent more time checking her phone than interacting with the guests. When I asked her what was wrong, she simply said, "Nothing. Everything's fine. Relax and enjoy." I decided not to give it much importance, at least not at that moment. I was more focused on enjoying the day and welcoming everyone who came with gifts and smiles. However, shortly after the party started, I heard a growing murmur among the guests. And when I turned my head towards the door, my heart stopped. There he was, M, standing at the entrance with an awkward smile and a bouquet of flowers in his hand. When I saw him standing at the entrance, the world seemed to stop for a moment. My heart raced, and a mixture of disbelief, fury, and anxiety took over. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I had made it perfectly clear that I didn't want that man at my baby shower. And yet, there he was, with his awkward smile and his stupid bouquet of flowers, as if nothing had happened. The conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to me. I could feel the stares of my friends and family wondering what the hell was going on. Even my partner, who was by my side, looked completely bewildered. "Who is that?" he whispered. But before I could answer, my sister rushed to the door with a nervous smile. "Em, I'm so glad you made it," she said, as if everything was perfectly normal. Normal? What part of this was normal? I couldn't believe she had the nerve to act as if this was a casual get-together and not a blatant violation of my boundaries. "What are you doing here?" I blurted out in a louder voice than I intended. I could feel my tone starting to crack between anger and surprise. The entire room fell silent, and my sister, still smiling, tried to calm the situation. "It's just for a moment," she said, lowering her voice, as if that made the situation less absurd. "I thought it would be nice for him to stop by and congratulate you in person." Congratulate me? After everything this man had put us through, I felt as if a bomb had exploded in my chest. "How dare you invite him knowing I don't want him here? Do you think this is a joke?" M, who had obviously noticed the tension, raised his hands in surrender. "I don't want to cause any trouble," he said in a calm voice that only irritated me more. "I just came to wish you the best. If you prefer me to leave, I understand." For a second, I thought he would leave. I wish he had. But my sister quickly intervened, putting a hand on his arm. "No, no, no. You can stay. This is a misunderstanding. She's just a little stressed because of the pregnancy." "Stressed?" I repeated incredulously. The words felt like a dagger. My sister was reducing my feelings, my boundaries, and everything that had happened with them to a simple hormonal overreaction. I felt a lump forming in my throat, but I wasn't going to let her make me look like the bad guy. "This has nothing to do with the pregnancy, and you know it," I said, my voice trembling. I turned to M and pointed to the door. "I want you out of here now." My sister stepped in as if she were protecting him from me. "Enough. He hasn't done anything wrong. Besides, he's my friend, and I think I deserve to have my friends here too." Her friend? The word hit me like a brick. Since when was M her friend? This didn't make any sense. For months, she had told me they barely spoke, that it was a cordial relationship, nothing more. But now it was clear that there was something else, something she had been hiding from me. The situation began to escalate rapidly. My partner, who had been watching everything silently, finally intervened. "I think we should respect my wife's wishes. This is her day, and it doesn't seem appropriate for someone to be here if she doesn't want them." But my sister didn't budge. "I can't believe everyone is acting like this is a tragedy. He came here with good intentions. Maybe, if you gave him a chance, you'd realize he's changed." Change. That word made me laugh, though not in a happy way. Change. Do you really believe that, after everything he did? I don't understand how you can even justify having him near, let alone bringing him to my baby shower. This isn't about him, or you. It's about me and my baby. The tension in the room was unbearable. M finally took a step back, as if he was considering leaving. But before he could, my sister blurted out something I'll never forget. "You know, I think you're being ridiculous. Not everything revolves around you. Maybe it's time you grew up and got over the past." Those words broke something inside me. My sister, my own blood, was invalidating everything I had lived through, siding with a man who had ruined our lives for years. I felt the tears starting to well up, but I held them back. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break down. Fine, I finally said, my voice surprisingly calm. If he doesn't leave, then I will. The room fell completely silent. Nobody knew what to do or what to say. My partner tried to stop me, but I looked him in the eyes, and he understood. This was no longer a safe place for me. With my head held high, I walked towards the back door and stepped out into the patio, leaving behind the baby shower I had once dreamed of. But I wasn't ready for what was going to happen next. The fresh air of the patio helped me calm my breathing a little, but my mind was still racing. How had it come to this? This day was supposed to be a moment of happiness, surrounded by love and support, not a scene of drama and betrayal. I sat down in one of the garden chairs, trying to process what had just happened, when I heard footsteps behind me. It was my partner. He came out slowly, with his hands in his pockets, as if he didn't know what to say to me. Finally, he stopped in front of me, and his eyes reflected the same mixture of disbelief and anger that I felt. "I'm so sorry," he said, breaking the silence. "I never thought something like this could happen. This is completely unacceptable." I nodded, but didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. The tears I had held back during the whole scene started to slide down my cheeks. My partner came closer and hugged me, letting me cry on his shoulder. It was the first time all day that I felt a little safe. After a while, I whispered, "I can't go back in there. Not while he's inside." He nodded. "You don't have to." "But I do. This can't stay like this." I watched him return to the house with a determination I hadn't seen in him before. My partner is a quiet person who rarely raises his voice, but I knew he wasn't going to let this situation go without saying something. I stayed outside, listening through the open windows, as things inside started to escalate again. "What are you doing here?" he demanded of Em, this time with a tone that left no doubt about his anger. "She doesn't want you here. This is her day, and you have no right to ruin it." "I didn't come to cause trouble," Em replied, with that calculated calmness that had always set my nerves on edge. "I just wanted to say hello and show my support." "Support?" exclaimed my partner. "She doesn't need your support. All she needs is for you to walk out that door and never come back." Then I heard my sister's voice trying to intervene. "Stop it, everyone. I don't understand why you're making this such a big deal. It's just a party. He's not doing anything wrong." That comment was the one that unleashed the storm. My partner responded with an intensity he rarely shows. "It's not a big deal, really? Don't you understand what you're doing here? This man stalked your sister for months. She asked you not to bring him. She clearly explained why, and you decided to ignore her. What kind of sister does something like that?" Silence fell for a moment. But then my sister replied, her voice on the verge of tears, "Because I wanted to give him a chance. He's changed, I swear. He's different now. I just wanted you to see him the way I see him." That was like a bucket of cold water. The way I see him. What did that mean? I didn't have to think long to understand it. My sister hadn't just resumed contact with Em, but she was probably considering getting back together with him, if she hadn't already. It was the only explanation that made sense. At that moment, something inside me clicked. I got up from the garden chair and walked back to the house. If they were going to talk about me, at least they would do it in front of me. When I entered, everyone fell silent. My partner and Em were face to face, their faces tense. My sister was off to the side, looking at me with a mixture of defiance and guilt. The other guests were sitting or standing, clearly uncomfortable, as if they didn't know whether to leave or stay. I stopped at the entrance and crossed my arms. "Is this true?" I asked my sister directly. "Are you seeing him again?" The expression on her face said it all before she could answer. It was a mixture of shame and stubbornness, that look I knew so well, when she knew she was caught, but didn't want to admit it. "That's none of your business," she finally muttered. "None of my business." I repeated, my voice rising. "Seriously? Do you have any idea what it means to have him here, what this does to me? You knew exactly how this was going to affect me, and yet you decided to bring him. Why? To prove a point? To convince me that he's a good person?" My sister tried to interrupt me, but I didn't let her. "You've always been like this. You always minimize what I feel, what I think. You always do what you want, regardless of who you hurt in the process. But this time you went too far. This time you didn't just ignore me, you betrayed me." The room fell completely silent, while my sister tried to find an answer. Finally, Em, in his typical attitude of false superiority, said, "I think I should go." "That would have been a good idea from the beginning." I replied coldly, pointing to the door. Without saying another word, Em left the bouquet of flowers on the table by the door and left. But the tension didn't disappear with him. Quite the opposite, it seemed thicker than ever. The silence that followed Em's departure was deafening. The guests were visibly uncomfortable, some murmuring amongst themselves and others looking at their phones as if searching for an excuse to leave. But my attention was completely focused on my sister. She was standing on the other side of the room, arms crossed and frowning, as if she were the victim of this whole mess. "Do you have anything else to say?" I asked dryly. My voice was calm, but inside I was burning. I felt betrayed in a way I had never experienced before. She sighed and finally spoke. But instead of an apology, what came out of her mouth was another justification. "I don't understand why you're making this such a big deal. He came with good intentions. If you had just listened to him, you would have realized he's not the person you think he is." "Not the person I think he is?" I repeated incredulously. "You want me to listen to someone who ruined our family's peace for years, who stalked and manipulated our family, and especially you? Do you really think that's something I can just ignore because now he's changed?" My sister remained silent for a moment, but then said something that chilled me to the bone. "You don't understand. He makes me happy." Those words were like a bucket of cold water. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My sister was willing to destroy our relationship, and apparently her own dignity, for someone like him. Everything was starting to make sense. Why she had invited him, why she was defending him so fiercely. It wasn't just a bad decision, it was a deliberate choice, driven by something I couldn't comprehend. "He makes you happy?" I said, my voice trembling. "At what cost? Mine? That of your own family? Do you know how much it has cost me to heal from everything he put us through? And now you have the nerve to bring him to my baby's shower and act as if I'm the one who's overreacting." My partner, who had been silent beside me, intervened. "This isn't just about you and him. This is about respect. This day was about her, about us, and you decided that your feelings and your decisions were more important than her well-being." "That's not how it was," my sister exclaimed, raising her voice for the first time. "I just wanted to show that he's not the monster you think he is, that he can be different. Everyone deserves a second chance." I laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, devoid of joy. A second chance? He had plenty of chances, and he destroyed each one, not just with you, but with everyone who was close to you. You yourself said it once, remember? All those nights you cried because you couldn't get out of that relationship. Remember how Mom and Dad had to help cover the legal expenses to get that restraining order? Or how all of us spent years trying to recover from the chaos he left behind? She didn't say anything, but I could see in her face that those words had hit her. However, instead of apologizing or even showing remorse, she returned to her defensive attitude. "Maybe you don't understand, but people change. And if you can't accept that, then maybe I shouldn't be here either." The room fell completely silent. The words hung in the air, heavy and definitive. My sister was willing to walk away from me, from our family, for a man who had been a source of pain and suffering. "Maybe you shouldn't," I finally replied, my voice filled with a sadness I couldn't hide. "If that's your choice, then it's yours. But don't expect me to be a part of it." She opened her mouth as if to answer, but then closed it and simply looked at me. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't know if they were from anger, sadness, or both. Finally, she turned around and left the room. All the guests stared at the scene, stunned, not knowing what to do. My partner took my hand. "I think it's time we ended this." I nodded without saying a word. I walked to the center of the room, where some friends and family were still standing, waiting for instructions. "Thank you all for coming," I said, trying to maintain my composure. "But I think it's best if we end here. I'm so sorry for all of this." Some of the guests tried to comfort me, telling me not to worry, that it hadn't been my fault. Others apologized and left quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. Little by little, the house emptied, until only my parents, my partner, and my best friend remained. When everyone had left, I collapsed into one of the dining room chairs, emotionally exhausted. My mom came over and put a hand on my shoulder. "This wasn't your fault," she said softly. "Your sister made a decision, and it was the wrong one. But don't let this ruin what's coming. You have a baby on the way, and that's what matters now." I wanted to believe her, but the weight of the betrayal was still squeezing my chest. The days following the baby shower were a whirlwind of emotions. The initial rage gave way to a deep sadness, a sense of loss I couldn't shake. My sister and I hadn't spoken since she left that day. And although part of me wanted to confront her again, another part knew there was nothing more to say. My partner did everything he could to cheer me up. We cleaned up the remnants of the party together, putting away the gifts that remained as silent witnesses to the chaos. He kept telling me over and over that this wasn't my fault, that I had every right to feel hurt. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize, I still felt responsible, as if I had somehow failed by not being able to prevent this situation. A few days later, my mom called me. "Your sister wants to talk to you," she said in a voice that tried to be neutral, but couldn't hide the worry behind her words. "She says she's ready to explain what happened." "Explain?" I replied incredulously. "What's there to explain? She made a decision, and that's it." "I know," my mom replied. "And believe me, your dad and I are just as confused and disappointed. But she's still your sister, and I think you both need to clear the air." I sighed deeply. I knew she was right. As much as I wanted to ignore it, my relationship with my sister was a fundamental part of my life, or at least it had been until now. I wasn't ready to cut her off completely, but I also couldn't imagine how to trust her again after what she had done. Finally, I agreed to talk to her. I asked her to come to my house, where I would feel more comfortable, and with the assurance that I could end the conversation if it became too difficult. She arrived that same afternoon, with swollen eyes and an expression of regret that I had never seen before. "Thank you for letting me come," she said softly, as she sat on the sofa opposite me. She seemed smaller, as if she had lost all her usual confidence and stubbornness. "Talk," I said, crossing my arms. I wasn't going to make it easy for her. If she wanted to fix things, she had to start by taking responsibility for her actions. She took a deep breath before beginning. "I know what I did was wrong," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Inviting him was a terrible idea, and I should never have ignored what you asked me." "Then why did you do it?" I asked directly. "Why did you think it was okay to bring him, knowing everything it meant to me?" Her face filled with tears as she spoke. Because I was confused. You've always seen me as the one who makes bad decisions, as the one who can't fix her life. And when him came back into my life, I thought that maybe, if he could change, I could change too. I thought that if you accepted him, it would mean that I also deserved to be accepted. That confession took me by surprise. I had never considered that my sister might feel that kind of insecurity. I had always seen her as someone stubborn and strong. But at that moment, she seemed like a completely different person. A part of me wanted to comfort her, tell her that she didn't have to prove anything to anyone. But another part couldn't ignore the damage she had done. "This wasn't about you," I finally said, my voice softer but firm. "It wasn't the time or place for you to resolve your issues with them. This day was for me, for my partner, for our baby. And you took that opportunity and made it about you. That's not okay." She nodded slowly, her tears falling silently. "I know. I ruined everything. And I don't know if you can forgive me, but I want to try to fix it. I don't want to lose you." My heart clenched upon hearing that. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think she was being sincere, but the pain was still too fresh, and I knew I couldn't just turn the page and pretend everything was okay. "I don't know if I can forgive you now," I admitted. "This isn't something I can easily forget. But I also don't want our relationship to end here. I need time, and I need you to understand that things won't be the same for a while." My sister nodded, accepting my answer with a maturity she had rarely shown before. "I'll do whatever you need. I just want you to know that I'm sorry, and I won't ever do something like this again." In the following months, my sister stayed true to her word. She gave me space and didn't try to force our relationship. Eventually, we started talking again, little by little, albeit cautiously. She assured me that she had completely cut off contact with them, something I confirmed with other sources before we began to rebuild our trust. Story 4. My mother passed away and left me her store, but my sister demanded that I give it to her. When I refused, she made a decision that changed everything. I'm Amelia. I'm 24 years old, and this is the story of how a second-hand store inherited from my mother ended up destroying my relationship with my older sister, Claire. It all started when my mother, who was the most generous and hardworking person I have ever known, passed away unexpectedly a year ago. It was a devastating blow for me, my sister, and me. We were her only direct family since my father left us when I was a child. Claire and Mom used to fight a lot, especially during the last years, but despite that, Mom always tried to stay close to both of us. Mom owned a small vintage clothing store in downtown Asheville, North Carolina. It wasn't a big business, but it had loyal customers and was my mother's dream since she opened its doors almost 2 decades ago. When she died, her will left me the store. Claire received a considerable sum of money, which was just what Mom had saved for her, thinking about the constant discussions they had. Even so, Claire wasn't happy. "This isn't fair," was the first thing Claire said at the reading of the will. "Why does Amelia get to keep the store, and I only get the money?" I tried to explain to her that Mom knew that I had worked in the store since I was 17 years old, and that I had even put university on hold to help her when she got sick. Claire, on the other hand, never showed any interest in the store. She didn't even know how many hours were worked there. Claire insisted that it was a mistake and that we should share the store, which sounded reasonable at first. However, it soon became clear that for her, sharing meant that she would take total control and I should leave. "I have always been Mom's favorite. This is the least you can do for me," she would say constantly, manipulating me with her tone. I tried to be understanding and even proposed that we both take charge of the store, but when I mentioned that I would continue managing it as Mom did, her response was, "That's outdated. We have to modernize this, change everything. What about turning it into a luxury boutique? Vintage doesn't sell anymore, Amelia." That broke my heart. I knew how much the store meant to Mom and how much it had cost her to keep it authentic. Despite my attempts to reason with Claire, she refused to listen. The weeks turned into months, and our relationship worsened. On one occasion, she even showed up at the store without warning and started moving things, talking about how she would reorganize everything. I had to ask her to leave, which caused a scene in front of the customers. It was humiliating. All of this led us to a huge family fight. Claire accused me of being selfish, of not respecting her as an older sister, and even of stealing what, according to her, belonged to her. But how could I give away something that Mom entrusted specifically to me? After our big discussion, I thought that Claire would simply walk away for a while to calm down, but I was wrong. A few weeks later, I received a notification from the bank. Claire had tried to access the store's account, claiming to be a co-owner. I was in shock. I didn't know how she had managed to obtain enough information to try it, but apparently, she had gotten some old documents from Mom and was trying to use them as proof that she also had rights over the business. It was a low blow, but I couldn't let this go. I immediately called Mom's lawyer, who assured me that the will was clear. The store belonged to me completely. However, that didn't prevent Claire from complicating things if she continued. Besides, what hurt me the most was that my own sister was willing to go over me in that way. From that moment on, things began to escalate in ways that I would never have imagined. Claire began to defame me on social media. She would post stories about how I had stolen our mother's legacy and how I had always been a selfish manipulator who didn't think of anyone but myself. The worst thing was that some of our relatives believed her. My Aunt Sophie, who had always been close to both of us, stopped answering my calls. My cousins also seemed to avoid me at family gatherings. It was painful to feel alone, as if somehow Claire was managing to isolate me from everything. But that wasn't all. One afternoon, I arrived at the store and found the main door open. I was alarmed immediately because I knew that I had closed it when I left the night before. When I entered, I saw the disaster. Empty shelves, clothes thrown on the floor, open boxes. Someone had entered and wreaked havoc. I called the police while I reviewed the security cameras. My heart sank. There was Claire entering the store with a couple of friends, taking boxes of clothes, and leaving everything upside down. When I confronted her, she denied everything at first. "What are you talking about? I have no idea what you're saying," she responded with the greatest impudence that I have ever seen in my life. But when I mentioned that I had the images from the cameras, she changed her strategy. "Those things are mine too, Amelia. Mom bought them with money that belongs to both of us. I didn't do anything wrong." I couldn't believe her cynicism. I tried to remain calm and told her that she couldn't come near the store again, but Claire simply laughed. "You can't stop me legally. You can't do anything. It's as much mine as yours." Despite her attitude, I knew that she was wrong, and that gave me some strength. I decided to file a formal complaint with the police and obtain a restraining order to protect the store, but that decision marked a point of no return in our relationship. Meanwhile, dealing with the store on my own was becoming increasingly complicated. The damage that Claire had caused had made some customers stop coming, especially because there were rumors running through the neighborhood that the store was in the middle of a family legal problem. I tried to save what I could, but it was difficult to handle everything emotionally. It was then when I decided to write a letter to remind myself why I was fighting so hard for this business. I wrote about the afternoons I spent with Mom in the store, organizing windows, learning about vintage fashion, and listening to stories from her customers. I remembered how the store was more than a business. It was a refuge for so many people, including myself. That letter helped me to focus and move forward despite everything. However, Claire wasn't ready to give up. A month later, I received a court summons. My sister had decided to sue me for the store, alleging that Mom wasn't in her full mental capacity when she wrote the will. When I received the court summons, I froze. Claire really was willing to drag this to court. She said that Mom wasn't in a condition to make decisions when she wrote the will, and that as daughters equally, we should divide everything equally. The most shocking thing was that she was willing to use something as painful as Mom's illness in her last years as a weapon to get what she wanted. Mom's lawyer, Robert, reassured me. He assured me that the will was solidly written and that there was no way that Claire could prove that our mother wasn't in full use of her mental faculties. Even so, the process would be long and exhausting. Claire had hired a lawyer who was not only motivated but also aggressive. They began to send letters asking for documents, medical records, anything that could support their case. All this while I was trying to keep the store afloat. During that time, I realized how little I really knew Claire. We had distanced ourselves in recent years, but I never thought that she would reach this level of cruelty. Each of her movements seemed designed to wear me down. She even tried to convince some of the store's old customers to stop buying there, arguing that the business was doomed and that it would soon change hands. It was devastating to see how some people that I had known for years began to walk away. In one of the preliminary hearings, Claire not only presented her argument that the will was invalid, but she also tried to paint me as an ungrateful daughter who had manipulated Mom to keep everything. While she was talking, something inside me broke. It was as if I were seeing a complete stranger. It was in the midst of this chaos when I discovered something that would completely change the course of the situation. One day, while cleaning Mom's office in the store, I found an old box full of documents. Among them was a diary that Mom had written during the last years of her life. I had never known that she kept a diary, but there it was, pages full of her thoughts, emotions, and most importantly, her vision for the store and the future. In one of the entries, I read something that left me in tears. I know that Claire will never understand how much this store means to me, but Amelia does. She has always been here taking care of this place as if it were her own. That's why I know that when I'm no longer here, it will be in the best hands. That diary was a gift fallen from the sky. Not only did it remind me why I was fighting, but it was also written proof of Mom's mental state and her clear intentions regarding the store. I immediately took the diary to Robert, who reviewed it and told me that it could be a crucial piece in the case. Meanwhile, Claire showed no signs of stopping. She began to appear in the store from time to time, completely ignoring the restraining order that I had obtained after her last act of vandalism. One day, she even brought a group of friends for them to enter and take photos of the place, saying that she was documenting evidence for the case. When I tried to stop her, she accused me of obstruction. I felt powerless, but Robert reminded me that all these actions were being documented and that ultimately they would only hurt her case. The hearings continued, and every time I saw Claire in the courtroom, I felt a deep pain. This was the person with whom I had grown up, the sister with whom I shared so many Christmases and birthdays, now turned into someone unrecognizable, willing to destroy me to get away with it. In one of the lowest moments of this process, I received an unexpected call. It was from Sophie, our aunt, who had been on Claire's side since it all started. She told me that she wanted to talk to me in person. I hesitated at first, but agreed to meet her at a local cafe. When I arrived, Sophie looked visibly uncomfortable. After a few minutes of trivial conversation, she finally blurted out what she had on her mind. She told me that Claire had asked her for money to cover her legal expenses and that she had been lying about the state of the store's finances. Sophie seemed sincerely repentant for having believed her so quickly and told me something that I didn't expect to hear. Amelia, Claire doesn't want the store because she cares about it. She wants the store because she thinks she can sell it and get some money quickly. She doesn't care about your mom's legacy. That comment was a bucket of cold water, but also a confirmation of what I had always suspected. Sophie, to my surprise, offered to testify in my favor if necessary. Although I didn't want to drag more family members into the conflict, I accepted her help. Claire had gone too far, and I needed all the help that I could get. The final day of the trial arrived, and both sides presented their arguments. Robert took Mom's diary as evidence and presented it along with the testimonies of Sophie and other close friends of our mother who confirmed her intentions regarding the store. The previous incidents, such as the looting of the store and the constant violations of the restraining order, were also mentioned. For her part, Claire tried to argue that the diary was irrelevant and that the witnesses were biased, but as the trial progressed, it became evident that her case didn't have a solid foundation. Her own lawyers seemed frustrated with the lack of compelling evidence. The trial ended after weeks of back and forth. When the judge issued his verdict, I felt as if my whole body was suspended in the air. The words resounded in the room. The will of the deceased is valid and clear in its intentions. The store legally belongs to Amelia, and there is not enough evidence to support the accusations of manipulation or mental incapacity. In addition, Claire is ordered to cease any attempt to interfere with Amelia's property. I couldn't help but cry when I heard those words. After everything that had happened, what Mom had wanted was finally recognized. Claire, on the other hand, stood up abruptly, visibly enraged, and left the room before the judge finished speaking. It was typical of her to evade any responsibility, I thought. I thought that everything would end there, but the worst was yet to come. Claire didn't stop even after losing the trial. A week later, I began to receive threatening messages from unknown numbers. They were things like, "Give your sister back what's hers, and you won't be safe until you do the right thing." Although I didn't have clear evidence that they came from Claire, the threats coincided too much with the way she spoke. I also began to notice that someone was following my movements. I often saw a car parked near the store or my house with the lights off, and when I tried to approach, it would leave. I decided to take serious measures. I consulted with a civil security lawyer to explore the possibility of a stricter restraining order. I also installed security cameras around the store and my house and began to vary my daily routines. I didn't want to give Claire or anyone else the opportunity to catch me off guard. In the midst of this chaos, the store was beginning to recover. Some of the customers who had walked away began to return, and new faces began to appear. One afternoon, while I was reorganizing a showcase, a woman named Margaret, who had been a loyal client of Mom for years, entered the store. Margaret was an older woman, kind and very wise, who always had comforting words. I knew that this store would continue to be a special place, she told me while she reviewed a vintage jacket. "Your mother would be very proud of you, Amelia. She always said that you had the right heart to keep this place alive." Those words gave me strength to keep going. It reminded me that although the road had been difficult, I was honoring Mom in the best way possible. However, Claire hadn't given up. A month after the trial, I received an unexpected call from the police. Claire had been arrested. Apparently, she had been caught trying to force the entrance of the store one night. The security cameras that I had installed captured everything. When I reviewed the recordings, my heart broke. There was my sister with a crowbar in hand, trying to enter the place that Mom had loved so much. How had we gotten to this? In the interrogation, Claire confessed that she was desperate. She had spent all the money that Mom had left her on lawyers and unnecessary expenses, and now she was on the verge of bankruptcy. To make matters worse, Sophie told me that Claire had accumulated a massive debt with personal loans and credit cards, all in an attempt to prove that she could manage the store better than I. Despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of sadness and compassion. Claire was my sister, and although she had caused so much damage, I couldn't wish her the worst, but I couldn't allow her to continue interfering in my life either. With the help of my lawyer, we secured a permanent restraining order, and Claire had to face minor charges for vandalism and trespassing. For the first time in months, I could breathe. The store was safe, and Claire could no longer approach me or my business. But the emotional damage was deep. Our relationship, which was already fractured, seemed completely unrecoverable. One day, I received a letter from Claire. It was brief and didn't sound like her. It said, "I know that I have done horrible things, but I want you to know that everything I did was because I felt that Mom always chose you. I felt invisible, as if I didn't matter as much. I'm sorry." Although those words moved me, I also felt that it was too late. Claire had crossed too many lines, and although I could forgive her in my heart, I knew that I couldn't trust her again. After receiving Claire's letter, I spent days thinking about what it meant. Was it a sincere apology or just another attempt at manipulation? I wanted to believe that my sister was repentant, but after everything that had happened, trusting her seemed impossible. I left the letter in a drawer and decided to continue with my life. The store was flourishing again. I had begun to organize small events like sewing workshops and clothing exchange nights to attract more customers and create a community around the place. Little by little, things were starting to feel normal again. I even signed up for a night business class at the local university to learn how to manage the business better. I felt proud of what I was building, but the shadow of Claire still lingered in my mind. One day, while I was in the store, I received an unexpected visit. It was Sophie, our aunt. She seemed nervous but also determined. She sat in front of me and took something out of her bag, an envelope full of documents. "Amelia, I think you need to see this," she said while placing the envelope on the table. Inside were bank statements and copies of emails between Claire and some people that I didn't recognize at first. When I read them, I froze. Claire had been trying to sell the store even before Mom died. She had contacted real estate agents and had talked with potential buyers, describing it as a property ready to modernize. Sophie had obtained these documents through a friend who worked in one of the real estate offices that Claire contacted. This was devastating. Everything that Claire had done, the trial, the threats, even trying to break in, wasn't just out of rage or jealousy. She had had a plan from the beginning. Get rid of the store to get quick money. Suddenly, everything fit. Claire had never seen the store as a legacy from Mom. For her, it was just a way to pay her debts and get ahead. Although the documents didn't change anything legally, since the store was mine and the court case was closed, they hit me deeply. I felt a mixture of rage and sadness at realizing how far Claire had been willing to go to betray not only me, but also the legacy of our mother. Sophie looked at me with pity. "I know that I can't fix all the damage that has been done, Amelia," she said, "but I thought that you should know the truth." I thanked her for her honesty, although the revelations left me emotionally exhausted. That night, while I was reviewing the documents once more, I decided that I could no longer carry this weight. Claire had made her choice, and although it pained me, it was time to let go of all the resentment and focus on what really mattered, honoring Mom and continuing to build something worthwhile. Months passed, and things finally began to stabilize. The store was busier than ever, and the night classes helped me to better organize the finances and the marketing. I even started to dream about opening a second location in a nearby city. One day, while I was closing the store, I received an unexpected call. It was Claire. I hesitated before answering, but finally, I did. "Amelia, I know that you probably don't want to hear me," she began. Her voice sounded weaker, as if all the conflict had worn her down as much as it had me. "I just want to say that I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I lost everything, and it was my fault. I know that you can't forgive me, but I needed to tell you." I didn't know what to say. I had waited for this moment, but when it finally arrived, I didn't feel relief or satisfaction. I only felt sadness. After a long silence, I responded, "Claire, I don't know if I can forgive you for everything that you did. It hurt me deeply, but I hope that you find a way to move forward. We all deserve a second chance, even you." We said goodbye after that, and although I can't say that our relationship has been repaired, something in me felt lighter. It was as if by letting go of the resentment, I could finally breathe again. Today, a year after all this chaos, the store continues to be the heart of my life. It's not just a business, it's a constant reminder of Mom's strength and love. Claire and I haven't talked since that call, but I have heard through Sophie that she is trying to rebuild her life. I hope that she succeeds, although I know that our relationship will never be what it was. Story 5. I discovered my husband was cheating on me with a younger coworker after being promoted to manager. So I gathered evidence, kept the house, exposed him at work, and filed for divorce. I have been married to my husband for 15 years. We both worked hard to have a comfortable life. Although our career paths have been quite different, I work as a freelance graphic designer, something that gives me freedom and creativity, while he has always been in the corporate world with strict hours and unbridled ambition. Maybe that's what attracted me to him at first, his determination and security. We never had children, not for lack of desire, but because there was always something more important, some project or goal to achieve. A little over a year ago, my husband was promoted to a manager position in his company. It was a huge achievement, something we both celebrated with a small dinner at home and a bottle of expensive wine that we kept for special occasions. He had always talked about reaching that level, and now that he had achieved it, I thought that our lives were finally going to stabilize. However, shortly after, I began to notice small changes. Suddenly, his workday became much longer than usual. What used to be predictable work hours turned into nightly meetings, business dinners, and last-minute emergencies. At first, I didn't think it was strange. After all, a new position means more responsibilities. But there was something in his behavior that bothered me. He was constantly checking his phone, even in moments when he used to be completely present. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I decided to let it pass, believing that it was just work stress. But what really made me doubt was a subtle change in his behavior towards me. He became more distant, colder. The conversations became superficial, and he seemed more interested in anything but what I had to say. However, I never realized that this was just the tip of the iceberg. One night, while we were having dinner together, his phone vibrated. He looked at it quickly and put it face down on the table, something he had never done before. He smiled at me awkwardly as if trying to divert my attention. It was then when I knew that something was going on. I decided not to confront him at that moment, but the seed of doubt was already planted. The following weeks, I tried to observe more carefully. I began to notice small things, like messages that he deleted immediately or calls that he only answered when he was away from me. One night, while he was sleeping, I saw his phone charging on the nightstand. I don't usually invade anyone's privacy, but my gut was screaming at me that something was wrong. I took his phone and with trembling hands opened his messaging application. The messages that I found left no room for doubt. He had been texting with one of his subordinates, someone who clearly worked in his team. I can't describe what I felt at that moment. It was as if the floor beneath my feet had crumbled. The texts were not only flirty but explicit. Photos, plans for meetings outside of work, and phrases that made it very clear that this was not just a simple mistake. This had been going on for some time. I wanted to scream, wake him up at that instant, confront him with the evidence in my hand, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the instinct to protect myself or a need not to act impulsively. Instead, I controlled myself, took a deep breath, and took photos of the conversations with my phone. I didn't know exactly what I would do with that information, but something inside me told me that I would need it. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed lying in the darkness, staring at the ceiling while he snored peacefully beside me. My mind was full of questions. Why? What did I do wrong? Why didn't I realize it before? But what hurt me the most was thinking about everything that we had built together and how he had put it at risk for something so superficial. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I prepared breakfast as always, but I noticed that he was particularly attentive to me, as if something in his subconscious told him that I suspected. His smile seemed fake, his words empty. At that moment, I decided that I was not going to confront him until I had a clear plan. I didn't want to give him the opportunity to manipulate me, apologize without meaning it, or delete evidence. This was much more than an argument. I was going to make sure that he faced the consequences of his actions. During the following days, I dedicated myself to collecting more information. I reviewed his emails, his messages on other platforms, and even the bank records. What I discovered was worse than I imagined. He had used money from our joint account to pay for dinners, gifts, and even a hotel in New York during a trip that was supposedly only for business. I couldn't believe how brazen he had been. In addition to that, I began to suspect that it wasn't just one woman. There were other conversations that, although not as compromising as the first, made it clear that he enjoyed the attention he received from his younger colleagues. All this filled me with rage, but also with determination. If he had destroyed our relationship, I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I decided that I was going to consult with a lawyer. I looked for someone specialized in divorce cases and explained the situation. The lawyer listened to me attentively and assured me that with the evidence that I had, I could get a favorable resolution for me. He told me about my rights and how we could proceed to guarantee that I came out of this situation with the greatest possible advantage. The next step was even more delicate. I wanted to make sure that he not only faced the legal consequences, but also the professional ones. It didn't seem fair to me that someone who had abused his position of power and betrayed his partner could continue forward without repercussions. I decided to investigate his company's policy regarding inappropriate relationships in the workplace. As I imagined, His company had a strict policy that prohibited any type of relationship between supervisors and subordinates. I took all the evidence that I had and prepared a dossier. I included screenshots, details of the expenses, and a summary of what had occurred. I wanted this to be something clean and organized so that there were no doubts. The lawyer helped me to write a formal letter that I sent to the Human Resources Department of his company from an anonymous email account. Meanwhile, at home, everything seemed normal. He continued acting as if nothing was wrong, and I strove to remain calm. But inside I knew that it was only a matter of time before everything exploded. A week after sending the information, I received a notification in my email. Human Resources had received my report and were initiating an internal investigation. I couldn't help but feel nervous, but at the same time, I knew that I was doing the right thing. That weekend, something unexpected occurred. While he was showering, his phone began to ring insistently. It was an unknown number, but I ignored it. However, a message appeared on the screen. "We need to talk. It's urgent. This can't go on like this." It was signed by the woman with whom I had found the most exchanges. Apparently, not only I was losing patience. After reading that message, an idea began to form in my head. If this woman was also feeling that things were getting out of control, maybe I could use that to my advantage. Instead of responding to the message or giving my husband any indication that I knew something, I decided to wait. Something told me that it was a matter of time before everything came to light, and I wanted to be ready. That Monday afternoon, while I was working from home, I heard my husband talking on the phone in his office. His tone was low, as if he was trying not to be heard, but clear enough to capture fragments of the conversation. He was saying things like, "We can't talk about this here," and "You have to trust that I'm handling it." My heart was beating 1,000 miles per hour, but I maintained my pose of not confronting him yet. I knew that the more he tried to cover his tracks, the more opportunities one would have to expose him. Days later, the moment that I had been waiting for finally arrived. He returned home with a serious and tense expression, and his first stop was not the living room as usual, but directly our bedroom. He closed the door, but I let my ears sharpen. I sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee while I waited for him to confront me or try to explain himself, but he didn't. Instead, 2 days later, I received a message from an unknown number. It was the woman with whom he had been having the most intense affair. The message said, "I know this is strange, but I think you should know what's going on. I feel horrible for what I've done, but your husband has been lying to you much more than you think. If you want, I can talk to you in person." I didn't know whether to respond, but after a few minutes of meditation, I decided that I wanted to know how deep the hole into which my husband had fallen was, and what else might come to light. We agreed to meet in a neutral coffee shop near the center of the city, a place where I knew that no one would recognize us. The meeting was strange, to say the least. She arrived dressed professionally with an air of genuine regret. She looked at me nervously while she sat in front of me with a cup of coffee that she didn't touch throughout the conversation. Before saying anything, she began, "I want you to know that I have no excuses. I know that I was wrong, and I know that nothing that I say can repair the damage, but I think you need to know the truth." What she told me during that hour was heartbreaking and revealing at the same time. She confirmed that her relationship with my husband had been going on for more than 6 months. It began as an innocent flirtation in the office, but quickly escalated to meetings outside of work hours, dinners, and even a trip that he justified as a corporate event. However, what really left me in shock was knowing that she wasn't the only one. According to her, she knew of at least one other woman, another subordinate with whom my husband was also involved. "At first I thought that I was special," she said with a broken voice. "But then I realized that he was repeating the same patterns, the same words, the same excuses. I feel used, and I don't know what to do with this, but at least I wanted you to know." When she finished talking, she offered me evidence, screenshots, emails, and even a photo of them together during the famous corporate trip. I took everything without saying anything, grateful for having more tools for what was to come. I didn't hate her, although in another moment of my life maybe I would have. I felt more pity for her than anything else. I said goodbye, thanking her for her sincerity and promising that I would keep her out of what I was planning to do. That night while my husband was sleeping, I opened the computer and organized everything that I had. There were no longer any doubts or questions in my mind. I knew what I had to do. First, I sent all the additional evidence to the Human Resources Department of his company. I included a chronological detail of the events and explained how his behavior was affecting both his relationship with me and the working environment of the office. I knew that this not only compromised his professional ethics, but also his position as manager. Then, I scheduled a meeting with my lawyer for the following day. I knew that with all the evidence that I had collected, I could not only proceed with the divorce, but also claim the majority of the shared assets, including the house. I had proof of his infidelities, of the misuse of the funds, and of his abuse of power at work. He was not going to get away unscathed from this. The following day, while we were having breakfast, I remained silent, waiting for him to say something, but he didn't. Then, when I finished my coffee, I looked at him and said quietly, "I know everything." His face paled immediately, and so began the conversation that changed our lives forever. The way in which my husband reacted when I said, "I know everything," was almost cartoonish. He froze completely with a toast halfway to his mouth, and his eyes began to search desperately for some indication of how much I knew. I didn't give him time to recover. I took out my phone and opened the folder with the screenshots that I had saved. "This is enough, right?" I said, pushing it towards him. He didn't say anything during what seemed like eternal minutes. He just sank into the chair and ran his hands over his face, as if he were trying to erase everything that had just happened. Finally, he murmured, "I can explain it." I laughed, literally laughed, because it was so ridiculous to hear that phrase that seemed taken from a bad movie. "What are you going to explain? That you've been sleeping with one of your employees for months, that you spent money from our joint account to pay for her hotels and dinners, or that this isn't something isolated because you also have other affairs in the office?" My voice broke a little at the end, and I hated myself for showing any type of vulnerability in front of him, but I couldn't help it. I was hurt, and all that I wanted at that moment was for him to understand how much damage he had done. All he did was nod, as if suddenly he knew that there was no way out of this. "Okay," he said finally. "I ruined everything. I'm sorry. Don't tell me you're sorry." I responded with more rage than I expected. "If you really cared, you wouldn't have done it, and much less repeated it. You made the decision to destroy our marriage, not me." After that, the conversation was direct and cold. I made it clear to him that I had already contacted a lawyer and that I planned to proceed with the divorce. He didn't try to stop me or argue. He simply accepted everything, which somehow made me feel worse. It was as if our relationship, those years of shared efforts, meant nothing to him. When I mentioned that I had also reported his behavior to human resources, for the first time I saw a flash of panic in his face. "What did you do?" he asked with a trembling voice. I explained that I had sent all the evidence to his company, detailing how he had abused his position as manager to enter into inappropriate relationships with subordinates. "It's possible that you'll be fired," I said without any type of compassion, "and if they do, it will be what you deserve." That night he packed some of his things and went to a friend's house. I didn't care where he was going. I just wanted him to get away from me. I stayed alone in the house, sitting in the living room with the lights off, trying to process what had just happened. I had taken the first step to get rid of him, but I knew that the path ahead would not be easy. A few days later, the first bomb arrived. Human resources from his company sent me a follow-up email. They had initiated a formal investigation, and as they explained to me, some employees had already confirmed my allegations. It was a relief to know that they were not ignoring the issue, but I also felt strange. This was not only affecting my husband, it was also having an impact on people that I didn't know. People who probably felt uncomfortable talking about this. 2 weeks later, my lawyer and I officially filed the divorce papers. During this time, my husband tried to contact me several times, but I ignored all his messages. I didn't want to listen to his excuses or give him the opportunity to justify his actions. Once he even appeared at the door, but I didn't let him in. He shouted from the other side that he wanted to fix things, but I knew that that was not possible. Meanwhile, the investigation of his company was advancing rapidly. I discovered through an internal contact, who preferred to remain anonymous, that he had not only had relationships with the 2 women that I knew, but that there were rumors of at least 2 others. The employees had started to talk among themselves, and the story was spreading like wildfire. The day that he was fired, I found out because he called me from an unknown number. I answered more out of curiosity than anything else, and the first thing that he said was, "I hope you're satisfied." His tone was full of resentment, and that only made me feel more secure in my decisions. "No, I'm not satisfied," I responded. None of this makes me happy, but at least now you'll have to face the consequences of your actions." I hung up before he could say anything else. The divorce process was faster than I expected, in large part thanks to the mountain of evidence that I had against him. I obtained the house, something that I knew hurt him deeply because it had been his greatest personal investment. I also got significant financial compensation that my lawyer made sure to include due to his reckless behavior and the emotional damage that he had caused me. The last thing that I did was something that many people would probably consider unnecessary. I shared my story anonymously with some people from our social circle, not because I wanted to take revenge, but because I felt that it was important that the truth come to light. I didn't want him to continue pretending to be someone that he wasn't. As for me, I'm working on rebuilding my life. It's not easy, but every day I feel a little stronger. Some months passed after everything officially ended. The divorce was finalized, the house was in my name, and my ex-husband practically disappeared from my life. The last thing that I knew of him was through a mutual acquaintance, who mentioned that he was living in a small apartment in the outskirts of the city and working in a much less prestigious job. The fall from his pedestal was fast and brutal, but I didn't rejoice over it. To be honest, I felt some pity for the person that he had become, although not enough to want to know more. As for me, the transition was not easy. Going from sharing your life with someone for 15 years to being completely alone is a monumental change. During the first weeks, the house felt strangely empty. It wasn't only the absence of his physical presence, but also the weight of the memories that still lived in every corner. Every time I passed through the kitchen, I remembered the mornings when he would prepare coffee for me. Every time I saw the couch, I thought about the movie nights that we used to share. But slowly, I began to make this space my own. The first thing that I did was redecorate. I changed the furniture, painted the walls, and got rid of everything that reminded me of him. It was therapeutic, as if each brushstroke and each box of donated things were a way of cleansing my soul. I also began to focus on myself in ways that I had neglected for years. I went back to running in the mornings, something that I used to love, but had stopped doing because I was always too busy. I started to read books that had been accumulating dust on my bookshelf. I even signed up for a pottery workshop, something that I had always wanted to try. As time passed, I began to open myself more to the idea of socializing again. At first, they were just meetings with close friends, people in whom I knew that I could trust and who had supported me during the chaos of the divorce. But eventually, I dared to step out of my comfort zone. I went to community events, joined a reading group, and began to meet new people. I wasn't looking for a relationship. I simply wanted to recover my sense of connection with the world. One of the biggest surprises was the response of the people to whom I told my story. Although I always shared it with discretion and only with those in whom I trusted, I realized that many women and men had gone through similar experiences. I didn't feel as alone as before, and that gave me strength. I even wrote an anonymous article for an online magazine about how to face infidelity and rebuild your life. It was cathartic, and the response that I received from the readers was overwhelmingly positive. One day, while I was checking my emails, I found a message that left me surprised. It was from the woman with whom my ex-husband had had his longest affair. I didn't expect to hear from her again, but her email was brief and sincere. She thanked me for having treated her with respect during our conversation in the coffee shop and mentioned that she had left the company shortly after the scandal. "I want you to know that I learned a very important lesson from all this," she wrote. "And although I can never change what I did, I hope that you find the happiness that I denied you." Although I didn't respond to the message, I felt an unexpected peace while reading it, not because I needed her apology, but because it was one more confirmation that this chapter of my life was finally closing. Story 6. My daughter decided to cut me out of her life because of her stepmother, and years later she seeks me out because she needs money for her dream wedding. It all began more than 15 years ago when my marriage to her father reached a point of no return. I was a young and dedicated mother. He a man who preferred to spend more time on his computer screen than dealing with the responsibilities of daily life. From the beginning, his approach to fatherhood was distant. In my mind, I always justified it. It's just stress from work, I thought. But after shouldering alone the sleepless nights, the visits to the pediatrician, and the thousands of small decisions that come with raising a child, I realized that I was raising my daughter on my own, even when he was right there in the same house. When I finally decided to leave him, it wasn't easy. He fought to keep everything, including our house and full custody of my daughter. Fortunately, the judge saw through his facade. Shared custody was agreed upon, and although I was financially at rock bottom, I had something he could never take away: time with my daughter. But of course, he didn't take long to find a way to manipulate her. Shortly after the divorce, she appeared, the new girlfriend of my ex-husband, who would later become his wife. She was everything I wasn't: young, stylish, with a perfect smile and a personality that charmed anyone. My daughter, who at that time was barely 6 years old, was fascinated with her from the beginning, and I naively thought it was a good thing. I believed that if she was going to spend time with another woman, at least it would be someone kind. But I didn't know how much this would change our lives. The weekends that my daughter spent with her father began to become more than just regular visits. She would tell me excitedly about the outings to restaurants, the expensive gifts, and the experiences that I couldn't offer her. While I worked double shifts to pay the rent, they would take her to concerts and buy her the latest model of cell phone. I can't lie, it hurt deeply. Not because I couldn't give her the same, but because I saw how she began to prefer a lifestyle that I couldn't compete with. The worst came when she began to compare everything I did with her stepmother. "She cooks better than you," she told me once, with all the innocence of a small child. Later, "Why can't we go on vacation like them?" Each comment was like a small dagger, but I reminded myself that she was just a child and that eventually she would grow up and understand. What I never saw coming was what happened when she turned 10 years old. Her father called me one day, and with a tone that tried to be casual, he told me that his wife had been helping a lot with my daughter and that perhaps we should consider formalizing that relationship. In other words, they were insinuating the idea that my daughter could be adopted by her. I don't know how I didn't scream at that moment. My response was firm: "No, she already has a mother, and that's me." But what I didn't expect was that my daughter, my own daughter, would begin to ask me the same thing. "Why can't I have two moms?" she asked one day. "Dad says you don't care, and she's always there for me." I tried to explain to her that it wasn't that simple, but at her age it was difficult to understand something so complicated. I felt alone in my struggle to maintain my place as her mother, while her father and his new wife did everything possible to push me out of the picture. As time passed, the situation only worsened. My daughter went from being excited about our movie nights and board games to canceling me at the last minute because Dad had something more fun planned. Every time I saw her, I felt that there was less of the girl I knew and more of someone who had been molded by her father and her stepmother. But I kept going, because she was my daughter and I was never going to give up on her. Things began to change drastically when my daughter turned 12 years old. The relationship between us, which had always had its ups and downs, began to fall apart in ways that I couldn't control. As much as I tried to maintain a connection with her, everything felt more and more distant. At that time, my daughter began to spend more time with her father and his wife. They always found a reason to extend the weekends. "We're doing a school project together," or "Dad said I can stay because we have a family gathering." I try not to make a fuss because I didn't want to be the mother who said no to everything. But internally, I felt as if they were stealing my daughter from me little by little. I remember a conversation in particular that marked a breaking point for me. I had prepared a special dinner because I knew that she was going through a difficult time at school. I wanted to cheer her up and have a space for her to talk to me. But that night she arrived late, and when I asked her why, she answered me with disdain: "We were at a restaurant." I didn't know that this was important. That comment, said with all the coldness of a teenager, shattered me. I tried to explain to her how I felt, but she didn't seem to care. The worst thing was that she began to idealize her stepmother in ways that made me feel invisible. Everything was about her: how she cooked, how she dressed, how she took her to places that I couldn't even dream of visiting. Once, in the middle of an argument, she let out something that I will never forget: "She understands me more than you do." They were 7 words, but they felt like a blow to the chest. Things reached a critical point when her stepmother got pregnant. Although I tried to remain optimistic and support my daughter during that transition, the family dynamic in her father's house changed drastically. My daughter, who had always been their priority, began to feel that she was being displaced. I saw her struggle with that insecurity, but instead of coming to me, she clung even more to them, as if she were competing for their attention. One day, my ex-husband called me to tell me that they were remodeling their house to prepare for the arrival of the babies. So far, everything sounded normal, but then he dropped the bomb: "We're turning our daughter's room into a space for the twins. She'll be in the basement, but we're decorating it especially so that it's her own place. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My daughter, who had been living comfortably in that house, was now going to be relegated to the basement because there were 2 new children on the way. When I asked her how she felt about it, she told me that she was excited, that the basement would be like her own apartment. But I knew that she was lying. I saw it in her eyes. She just wanted to please them. She wanted to be part of that new perfect family that they were creating. Even so, it hurt me that she didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. The situation worsened even more after the twins were born. During the first months, my ex and his wife didn't want my daughter to be in the house as much as before. They said that they needed to adjust to the new routine, as if my daughter were a stranger who could come and go as they pleased. I tried to talk to him, to say that this was affecting our daughter, but he always had an excuse. "She's fine," he would say, as if that solved everything. When they finally let her return, her attitude toward me changed completely. It was as if the little bond that we had left had disappeared. She began to be more distant, more critical. There was nothing that I could do that was enough. If I offered her help with her homework, she would tell me that I didn't know enough. If I tried to plan an outing, she would find some reason to cancel it. But the worst was when she began to use me as a kind of excuse to justify anything that didn't go well in her life. "It's your fault that Dad and Mom," referring to her stepmother, "are stressed with me," she told me once after I had to intervene so that they wouldn't leave her as the permanent babysitter of the twins. My intention had been to protect her, but she saw it as a direct attack. As much as I tried to explain to her that my priority would always be her well-being, all she heard was how her father and her stepmother were the only ones who really understood her. And although I tried not to take it as something personal, it was difficult not to feel that I was losing my daughter. During that time, I would spend entire nights crying, asking myself what I had done wrong. Was I too strict? Didn't I listen to her enough? Was it my fault that she preferred her other family? Every time I tried to get closer to her, she seemed to move further away. And then came the day when she stopped calling me Mom altogether. The day she stopped calling me Mom was one that I will never forget. I had noticed the gradual change in her way of referring to me. She went from Mom to my first name, which began as a simple teenage experiment but gradually became permanent. At first, I let it pass, thinking that it was a phase. I told myself that it wasn't worth arguing over something so small, but over time I realized that it wasn't a phase. It was her way of distancing herself emotionally from me. One day when I was at my house, I prepared her favorite dish for dinner. I had spent hours cooking peacefully. When she arrived home, I saw how her face twisted into an expression that I had never seen before. "Thanks, but I already ate at Mom's house," she said with total indifference. That word, said so easily, left me paralyzed. She wasn't talking about me. She was talking about her stepmother. I tried to remain calm. I asked her how her day had been, trying to act as if nothing had happened, but inside I felt as if my heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. That night, after she went to sleep, I locked myself in the bathroom and cried. It was a deep, heartbreaking cry, the kind of cry that you can't contain, even if you try. How had I gotten to this? At what point did my daughter stop seeing me as her mother? The distancing only grew from then on. Every time I tried to start a conversation, it turned into an argument. If I asked her to do something as simple as pick up her room, she would answer me with a sarcastic comment. "That's not something Mom would make me do." If I reminded her that she had pending homework, she would complain that I was too strict, that I wasn't like her other family. No matter what I did, it was always wrong. It was around this time when her father and her stepmother began to insinuate something that I never thought they would hear in my ears. In a custody meeting that had initially been convened to discuss a change in visitation schedules, my ex-husband dropped an idea that left me breathless. "We've been talking, and we think it would be better for everyone if Tara spent more time with us. She feels more comfortable here." I froze. I tried to maintain my composure, but my voice trembled when I answered him. "Are you suggesting that she move in with you full-time?" My ex-husband smiled as if he were making a reasonable offer. "We don't want to force you to do anything, but we think it would be the best thing. Danny does so much for her. And well, you seem to be busy with work." It was as if I had been punched in the chest. That same night, I talked to my daughter about the conversation. I asked her what she thought, hoping, begging that she would tell me that she wanted to stay with me. But instead she looked at me fixedly and said, "I think it would be better for everything. I'm happier there." Those words left me breathless. As much as I tried to reason with her, to explain to her that I would always be there for her, that I loved her more than anything in the world. She had already made a decision. There was nothing that I could say to change her opinion. The process of making the change official was faster than I thought it would be. I felt as if I were signing a contract that confirmed that my daughter was no longer mine. Although custody was still technically shared, in practice, she spent almost all her time with her father and her stepmother. I became a spectator of her life, someone whom she visited from time to time, more out of obligation than out of desire. The months that followed were the loneliest of my life. I realized that I had no one to talk to about this. My friends tried to comfort me, but they couldn't understand the pain that I felt. It's a type of loss that you can't explain with words. It's not like a breakup or a death. It's an open wound that never stops hurting because the person that you love is still there, but acts as if you don't exist. As time passed, I tried to move forward. I immersed myself in my work. I tried to focus on my well-being, but every time I saw a photo of my daughter on social media, smiling next to her new family, I felt that I was falling apart inside. It hurt, but I never stopped loving her. Years passed without our relationship improving. My daughter's calls became more and more sporadic until they finally stopped completely. The few times that I tried to contact her, whether to greet her on her birthday or ask how she was, I was met with cold and monotonous responses, as if I were talking to a stranger. It was painful, but I learned to accept that this was the reality of our relationship. I took refuge in my work and in new friendships. Over time, I met someone special. At first, I resisted the idea of letting someone into my life. My heart was still broken by the distance with my daughter, and I felt guilty for even thinking about finding happiness somewhere else. But this person, let's call him Henry, was patient with me and understanding. Most importantly, he made me feel that I was worth trying again. Henry helped me see that I couldn't blame myself for the decisions of others, even if those decisions came from my own daughter. Little by little, we built a life together, and for the first time in a long time, I began to feel happy. Although my daughter remained distant, I found an emotional balance that I never thought possible. My world no longer revolved completely around her, and then out of the blue came that call. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was in my office reviewing emails when I saw her name on my phone screen. My heart skipped a beat. It had been years since I heard her voice. I hesitated for a moment, thinking that perhaps it was a mistake, but finally I answered. Hello. Her voice was the same as I remembered it, but there was something different in her tone. She seemed nervous, as if she didn't know how to start the conversation. Hi. I just wanted to know how you are, she said, as if I were a casual acquaintance instead of her mother. My mind was full of questions, but I forced myself to remain calm. I'm fine, thanks. And you? How have you been? What followed was an awkward conversation, full of long pauses and short phrases. She told me that she was engaged, that she had found the love of her life, and that they were planning a wedding. As she spoke, my heart filled with mixed emotions. On the one hand, I was happy to know that my daughter was building a life for herself. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore the fact that this was the first time in years that she had communicated with me, and she was doing it as if nothing had happened. Finally, after a few minutes, she got to the point of the call. Well, I wanted to talk to you about something important, she said hesitantly. I know that we haven't talked much, but I wanted to ask you for something. My stomach sank. I knew that this wasn't just a courtesy call. She explained to me that her father was going through financial difficulties and that her stepmother wasn't willing to help her with the costs of the wedding. I know that you're doing well now, she said, referring to my relationship with Henry and our professional success. And I thought that maybe you could help me pay for the wedding. I remained silent for a moment, trying to process what I had just heard. After years of ignoring me, of choosing her stepmother over me at every opportunity, now she was seeking me out because she needed money. I couldn't help but feel used, but at the same time, she was still my daughter. As much as her past indifference hurt me, a part of me wanted to help her. I wanted to believe that this was an opportunity to rebuild our relationship. I understand that you want to have a beautiful wedding, I said finally, trying to maintain my composure. But I can't help but wonder why you're asking me for help now. It's been years since we talked, and well, I'm not sure how this fits into everything that's happened between us. There was a silence on the other side of the line. Finally, she spoke. I know that things haven't been easy between us, but you're my mother. I thought you would want to help me. Her tone had a hint of reproach, as if I were the one who had failed. I took a deep breath. trying not to let the frustration take over me. I've always loved you, and I always will, but I need time to think about this. I hung up the call, feeling more confused than ever. Part of me wanted to help her, to show her that despite everything she could still count on me. But another part of me knew that this wasn't the right thing to do. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. After everything that had happened, did I really want to start this new stage with her under these circumstances? That night, I talked to Henry about the call. He was direct. You can't let her use you just because she feels that you're in a better position now. You have to protect yourself, because no one else will. His words resonated with me. I knew that he was right, but making a decision wasn't going to be easy. I spent days thinking about what to do. Finally, I sat in front of my computer and wrote her a long and honest message, explaining how I felt and why I couldn't simply pay for her wedding as if nothing had happened. I sent it with my heart in my throat, knowing that it could mean the definitive end of our relationship. I sent the message with a knot in my stomach, rereading every word as I wrote it. I tried to be as honest and compassionate as possible, but I also knew that I had to set boundaries. This was the message that I sent her. Dear daughter, I was so happy to receive your call after so long. Knowing that you're doing well and that you've found someone to share your life with is wonderful news. I've always wanted the best for you, and hearing that you're planning a wedding fills me with emotion. However, I must be honest with you. Many years have passed since you decided to distance yourself from me. I never stopped loving you, but I've also had to accept that our relationship changed in ways that I never expected. The emptiness that your departure left hasn't been easy to overcome, and although I've done everything possible to move forward, those wounds are still there. I understand that you're now seeking my support for your wedding, but I can't ignore what's happened between us. It's not a question of money. It's about what this situation represents. I can't simply pretend that everything is fine and offer you my financial help without first addressing the pain and the distance that have existed between us for all these years. I would love to talk to you more in depth, to hear how you feel, and to work on rebuilding our relationship, if that's something that you also want. But paying for your wedding isn't something that I can do at this time. I hope that you can understand my decision. You will always be my daughter, and I will always wish the best for you. With love, Mom. After sending the message, I spent days staring at the phone, waiting for her response. I had the hope that she would understand it, that this would be the beginning of a dialogue that would help us heal, but the response that arrived was quite the opposite. She wrote me a short, almost cold message. I knew that you weren't going to help me. You've always been selfish, you only think of yourself. That's why Dad and Mom have always been better. I don't need your money or you. I hope that you can move on with your life, because I already did years ago. I read those words over and over, feeling how each one was like a knife that was sinking deeper. Her rejection was definitive, and her choice of words was brutal. She didn't even try to hide her contempt or her resentment. In an instant, I felt that everything that we had ever shared was fading away. I cried for hours that night, embraced by Henry, who consoled me in silence. He didn't tell me that everything was going to be okay, because he knew that it wouldn't be, at least not for a while. But he reminded me of something important. This isn't your fault. You did the best that you could with what you had. Her rejection doesn't define your value as a mother or as a person. Over time, those words began to settle in my heart. I realized that I had done everything possible for my daughter, even when she had chosen to remove me from her life. I couldn't force her to love me, but I could decide how to react to her rejection. I could choose to move forward,